David. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Major General Frederick Padilla, National Defense University President, welcome to National Defense University. Welcome both of you, to you here in the live audience as well as to the live stream audience, particularly those at the Marshall Center in Garmisch, Germany, and at the Perry Center, alumni associations and organizations located throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. Today's program is going to be streamed in both English and Spanish. During the question and answer and discussion period, audiences may ask questions in either language. You are provided with translation devices. If you need one but don't have one, raise your hand and we'll provide it for you. And the code, for those of you with listen devices, English is on channel I or O. Spanish is on channel S. If you have a personal device, English is channel 5 and Spanish is channel 7. During the Q&A period, we'll pass around handheld mics. And if you have a question, please make your question crisp, sharp, to the point, and then turn the mic off when you're done with it. At the conclusion of each of the segments of this program, we're going to have a short stand-in-place break so that the operations team can replace the water and change the name tags. It's not a coffee break, just a stand-in-place break. So please bear that in mind. And please silence your phones if you haven't already. For this event, we have a limited number of copies of the book Beyond Convergence. For those of you who didn't get a copy, don't fear. We have thousands more coming, but we had this first printing done just for you. If you want a copy and haven't received one, please fill out the cards that were presented to you, and we will, with your address and email, and we will send you one as soon as they come in. This event is a collaboration between two great organizations, the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies and the Center for Complex Operations. And before we begin, I want to, a few thanks are in order. First, thanks to our great partners at the Perry Center, the team that helped us put the book together and the event together, and gave us the opportunity to launch this book, Beyond Convergence. Special thanks to Professor George Benson, the director of the Caribbean Regional Drug Law Enforcement Training Center in Jamaica, for hosting today's program. For the participants in the Operational Field Commanders course at the National Police College in Jamaica, and also to the Center for Strategic Security Studies and the Colombian War College in Bogota for hosting the program there. Thanks to all of those who helped think through, write, edit, proof, print, and publish Beyond Convergence. Thanks to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats, Ms. Karen Hollis, who is the patient, very patient, most patient sponsor of our book, Beyond Convergence. Ma'am, it's finally published. I think we can manage getting you one. Save one copy for Des D. Hollis. At this point, I'm going to introduce formally Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Karen Hollis, who is the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats. She leads the Department of Defense's global counter-narcotics and threat finance policies and operations, among other global issues, with a budget of over $1 billion. Before this post, she's had a variety of senior posts in the Department of Defense, U.S. Southern Command, the National Security Council, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, dealing with Western Hemisphere affairs, special operations and low-intensity conflict, interagency collaboration, among other issues. I view her as a visionary, using the resources at her disposal to counter the many illicit forces causing misery and distress and making life nasty, brutish, and short for far too many people in the Western Hemisphere and beyond. With that, the rest of her resume is in your program, and I would invite you to the podium. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you. It's great to be here, finally, and to do this big event. I'm really happy to be here and happy to see all your faces. As Michael said, I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats, and I oversee the Department's defense policies and activities aimed at reducing drug trafficking and other forms of transnational organized crime. I'd like to thank NDU's Institute for Strategic Studies, the Center for Complex Operations, and the William J. Perry Center for organizing today's events and their work to produce this book, Beyond Convergence, World Without Orders. Thanks as well to all the authors who contributed to the book for sharing their insights and research with us. I especially want to recognize Hilary Matfess and Michael McClatchick for their vision and roles as the volume's editors. This book will provide an enhanced understanding of how illicit networks operate, how our adversaries use these networks, and how we and our partners can address the challenges posed by them. Today's conversation started in 2011 with a seminar on convergence hosted by NDU. It reached a wider audience with the 2013 publication of the proceeds, Convergence, Illicit Networks, and National Security in the Age of Globalization. I'm told that book turned out to be the most requested publication in NDU's history. It speaks to the relevance of this area of studies and to the desire of national security practitioners, scholars, and students to gain better understanding of illicit networks' impact on global security. Spurred by that success and the great interest sparked by the original Convergence seminar and book, in February 2015, many of us met here in this room to discuss the latest trends in ongoing convergence of various adversarial groups and network adversaries. We noted many examples of how state and non-state actors cooperate with each other in ways that threatens global security and stability. Today, I'm very excited to announce the release of this companion volume. I thought I was going to hold the book up, but I don't have a book. Thank you, Michael. We noted how in the world of books and music, writers and musicians often struggle. Thank you very much. I actually printed my own copy of it, but that's okay. Writers and musicians in this world of books and music often struggle to follow up on a bestseller #1 hit with a sequel that matches or exceeds the popularity of the original. In the case of Beyond Convergence, I predict this volume will not only equal but will surpass its predecessors in both popularity and value to our national defense and security communities. I predict this in part because what has happened in the 20 months since we convened here for Beyond Convergence discussion. Since then, world events have confirmed many of our hypotheses, from the persistent challenges posed by convergence of the nature and the nature of its evolution. We and our partners run the risk of falling behind and keeping pace with these amorphous and complex threats, given the institutional and bureaucratic hurdles that often impede responses by governments and organizations charged with addressing agile threats. Indeed, I think here today we need to address several pressing questions. Will we and partner nations, including our ministries, our militaries, our law enforcement agencies, and other elements of government, be able to adapt and respond rapidly enough to the developments described in Beyond Convergence? Are we ready and able to envision, detect, and prepare for future trends in the evolution of illicit networks? In other words, are we prepared to move beyond convergence? For example, will we move beyond convergence when it comes to increasing and improving cooperation among government agencies and across national borders? Are we on track to develop new doctrines, technologies, and capabilities to enable us to counter hybrid networks that mix criminal and terrorist elements? Will we be successful in working with Congress to update our authorities and appropriations in recognition of the fact that transnational criminals engage in multiple illicit activities, including but not limited to drug trafficking? Today, I'd like to discuss a few steps that my office is taking to help lead the Department of Defense into the era beyond convergence, including as it relates to our support for law enforcement and to partner nations in the Western Hemisphere. Before I do that, let's take a moment to survey what we've seen over the past 20 months. We see nations across the globe continuing to struggle to exercise effective sovereignty on and within their borders. We see violent non-state actors such as transnational criminal organizations occupying vacuums created by ungoverned and undergoverned spaces, including many of those in the Western Hemisphere. To quote Phil Williams in the opening sentence of his chapter on the global crisis of governance, quote, "The world has entered a period of kaleidoscopic, irregular conflicts in which the reassertion of traditional geopolitical rivalries is inextricably linked with the activities of a bewildering assortment of violent non-state actors," end quote. And you should try saying that sentence. That is a very complicated sentence. But it conveys a very important thought. There are many locations where the problem is not the absence of state control, but rather the wrong type of state control, where corrupt officials trade security and their citizens' well-being for personal gain. We've seen the emergence of the so-called Islamic State, which exploits people and territory under its control and uses illicit oil and natural gas sales to help fund its operations and to extend its terror network around the globe. Jessica Stern describes in her chapter on how ISIL has used these sales, as well as trafficking in human beings and antiquities, drugs and antiquities, to enable its organizational survival. 1 month after the Beyond Convergence seminar, as Doug Farah notes in his chapter, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, testified before Congress that in Russia, quote, "The nexus among organized crime, state actors, and businesses blur the distinction between state policy and private gain," end quote. Doug highlights that as we also see this type of behavior in the Americas. In Colombia, where the next steps in the peace process remain uncertain, criminal organizations are methodically positioning themselves to increase profits and diversify illicit businesses in a post-conflict environment. Terrorists and transnational criminal organizations also exploit human beings by using trafficking in persons and human smuggling to advance their operational and financial interests. ISIL's use of sexual slavery and migrant smuggling and the attempts by persons of concern to enter the United States and the illicit organizations and smugglers who facilitate their attempts are examples of this. Wildlife trafficking continues to threaten not only the survival of iconic animal species, but our collective security. Whether we see drug trafficking organizations in Mexico profiting from the sale of endangered fish bladders, or African insurgencies financed by the sale of elephant ivory and rhino horn, the harm caused by these convergent threats to our society, indeed to our earth, are evident. And finally, as Tuesday Riatano and Andrew Tablusi have noted, we are seeing the evidence of illicit actors using social media and other cyber-based networks to coordinate and finance their operations, brag about their activities, and broadcast messages of hate. I could go on to describe additional examples, but instead I recommend reading to gain the fullest understanding of these complex threats. Faced with these developments and the certainty the illicit threat networks will continue to evolve and converge in ways that threaten our national and global security, what should we do? I recall the questions posed by one of the speakers near the end of the 2015 Beyond Convergence seminar. What are we doing today just because we've always done it that way? How much of what we're doing today is based simply on past practice? Finally, are we keeping pace with a constantly changing world? With these and other questions in mind, I'd like to describe a few ways DoD is positioning itself to plan better for and respond to an international security environment that is moving beyond convergence. To more effectively anticipate, plan, and counter future evolutions of the types of illicit networks, threat networks described in Beyond Convergence, we need an updated strategy. The Department last produced a counter-narcotics and global threat strategy in 2011. My office is presently in the final stages of developing a new strategy to counter drug trafficking and other illicit threat networks. The upcoming strategy builds upon the 2011 strategy, but it presents what we like to think of a more balanced treatment of threats, priorities, and objectives, due in part to what we learned since 2011 about the convergence of illicit threat networks. We also aim to make the strategy more strategic. In other words, we've placed greater emphasis on the strategy's underlying visions, goals, and priorities while empowering the combatant commands and other defense components to determine the optimal balance of operational ways and means to achieve them. Put another way, the strategy will focus on the why and the what, and leave it to the commands and components to propose the how. Although we are still finalizing the strategy, I can share with you some of our thinking behind it. We are trying to accomplish three main goals. First, we want to strengthen our U.S. and international partners' efforts to combat drug trafficking and other illicit threat networks. Second, we want to support the disruption and neutralization of illicit threat networks so that they lose the capacity to conduct sustained operations. Third, we want to support and enable U.S. and international efforts to reduce drug trafficking and other criminal activity so that fewer drugs enter the United States and other forms of transnational criminal activity decline. These are very ambitious goals, we recognize that, but given the stakes and the negative impact these networks have on the security of our country and our citizens, we must aim for nothing less. To achieve these goals, we've designed objectives that emphasize 5 main points. Synchronizing strategy and planning efforts among DoD and U.S. government partners. Enhancing domain awareness via intelligence and physical detection and monitoring capabilities. Building the capacity of partners to become more formidable in countering illicit threat networks. Encouraging cooperation and collaboration among partners with respect to intelligence and information sharing. And finally, supporting and enabling the operations of U.S. and international law enforcement partners to disrupt and disable illicit threat networks by targeting their leadership, operations, logistics, communications, finances, and key facilitators. So how are we going to do this? We intend to focus our efforts on 7 priorities. In summary, these are disrupting ISIL's sources of funding and revenue generation, disrupting and degrading the flow of heroin from Mexico and Afghanistan, supporting Colombia's transition to peace with a focus on Colombia's counter-narcotics strategy and on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, promoting stability in Central America by enhancing security across the air, land, and maritime domains to support these nations' efforts to reduce the flow of illicit drugs, weapons, and cash throughout the region. Degrading the ability of illicit threat networks to threaten the stability of sub-Saharan Africa, and targeting the unlawful diversion and smuggling of chemical precursors to and from Asia, South America, and North America. And lastly, disrupting illicit networks that threaten the stability of Eastern Europe. While we plan to prioritize and refocus our efforts, I want to note that we are not newcomers to these subjects. Indeed, we have been working to support U.S. and international partners in these 7 areas for a while, and in some cases for decades. For example, DoD continues to provide specialized education and training to the Colombia military and law enforcement partners as well as the intelligence support to current operations. Notwithstanding the future direction of Colombia's peace process, the ongoing threat of violence and criminality make continued cooperation between the United States and Colombia vital. My office has also established regional interagency fusion centers in the Middle East and Europe to improve information sharing and to support counter-drug and counter-illicit trafficking operations involving DoD and other U.S. agencies and international partners. We've also built a small, effective counter-threat finance capability within the department. We provide counter-threat finance support to law enforcement agencies and to military operations against economic and financial targets, most notably against ISIL. Informed by DoD's counter-threat finance analysis, coalition military operations have struck multiple bulk cash storage sites and targets, affiliated with ISIL's illicit energy industry. These strikes have decreased ISIL's oil production and their ability to generate revenue used to fund continued operations. As we approach the end of one administration and the beginning of another, my prediction is that over time we will see a shift in the emphasis in DoD's support to counter transnational organized crime. Although counter-narcotics support will continue to comprise the majority of DoD's contribution to the fight against transnational organized crime, I think DoD will continue to open the aperture over time. I'm mindful the DoD counter-narcotics authorities and programs arose to counter threats during the 1980s. The international security environment and the threats we face have changed considerably since then. DoD must posture itself to respond to the new realities of the 21st century's second decade. Some of our closest and longest-standing international partners are already doing so, and they are adapting their approaches away from a strict focus on counter-narcotics to address the broader threat spheres that include not other illicit threat networks and financial flows. DoD's authorities and the vast majority of its resources, in the name of my appropriation, remain foundationally tied to one form of illicit trafficking. I do not advocate changing this focus overnight, but I do believe we need to continue to lay the groundwork for the department to shift over time. In conclusion, you all should know that we've updated our strategy, policy, and programs, and we've drawn from the insights generated by the Convergence and Beyond Convergence discussions and by the work of the contributing authors and panelists. The release of Beyond Convergence and today's own conversations will generate more dialogue across the national security community that will inform and improve our policies and programs. Finally, I would like to take note that the release of the Beyond Convergence comes just in time for the holidays. What a useful gift for the national security professional. I look forward to this afternoon's panel discussions. Thank you very much, Michael. And I'm also to hearing Admiral Tidd's observations and recommendations. Right now, I'll be happy to take a few questions or listen to a few reactions and responses to the questions I've posed. Thank you very much. We're good.
Thank you, ma'am. I'd like to give you a few minutes to stand up and have the first panel come up to the stage, please. I've been informed that Spanish is on Channel H. All right. In some ways, we in the Western Hemisphere are very lucky. Comparatively little interstate war, recently significant decline in intrastate war, historical tradition of statehood, rich cultures, and mostly strong economies, comparatively. But history frowns on those who take their security and prosperity for granted. And everything we've accomplished in the Western Hemisphere can be reversed. Everything is vulnerable. There is a wide variety of threats posed by those who wantonly sacrifice the public good for their private gain, including transnational and transregional criminals, international terrorists, and globally networked insurgents. The threat is compounded by the reality that these diverse networks are interacting with unprecedented velocity and magnitude, enabled by new technologies and extensive financial resources. The book that we're launching today, Beyond Convergence, seeks to warn readers of what might come if steps aren't taken to mitigate these threats and these trends. And to moderate the first panel, we have my co-editor, Hilary Matfus, formerly of the National Defense University and now with the Institute of Defense Analyses. Hilary, the mic is yours.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for being here, and it's nice to come back and see some friendly faces in the crowd and to launch what I hope you all will agree is a really incredible effort by a number of our authors in the Beyond Convergence book. After working on it with Michael for so long, it's great to see it in its final form. And we have two of our authors here today and a third incredible panelist. All three of them asked me to be brief with their introductory remarks, which is difficult when you have such an accomplished panel. But if you'll bear with me, I'll try and give you a 30,000-foot view of all they've accomplished before they launch into their presentations. First, we'll be hearing from Phil Williams, who is a self-described Welsh in exile, currently living in Pittsburgh, where he holds the Wesley W. Postvar Chair of International Security and is the director of the Matthew B. Ridgway Center for International Security Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. He has been researching transnational organized crime and related issues since the early 1990s. Dr. Williams has been published extensively in the field of international security. He has published in Survival, Washington Quarterly, the Bulletin on Narcotics, Scientific American, Crime, Law, and Social Change, and International Peacekeeping. As if that wasn't enough, Dr. Williams was also the founding editor of a journal entitled Transnational Organized Crime and has edited several volumes on that topic. After that, we'll be hearing from Rear Admiral Olson, who since January of 2015 has served as the United States Interdiction Coordinator at the Office of National Drug Control Policy, where he's responsible for the coordination of interagency efforts to interdict illicit drugs from entering the U.S., ensuring those actions are consistent with the National Drug Control Strategy, developing and issuing a National Interdiction Command and Control Plan, assessing the sufficiency of agency assets committed to the illicit drug interdiction, and advising the ONDCP director on the efforts of each agency. I can't imagine how he maintains such a cheery disposition when I'm exhausted from merely listing all that he does. He has a long and distinguished career both at the Office of National Drug Control Policy and within the U.S. military. Finally, we'll be hearing from Doug Farah, who's the president of IBI Consultants and a senior visiting fellow at the National Defense University Center for Complex Operations. He's a national security consultant and an analyst, and his experience in the field and with open source intelligence is unparalleled. He has worked for 2 decades as a foreign correspondent and investigative reporter for the Washington Post and other publications covering Latin America and West Africa. He continues to travel to the region frequently, publishing groundbreaking research in a variety of outlets. Thank you so much, and can we give them a warm welcome? Dr. Williams?
Thanks so much, Hilary, and thanks to both you and Michael for the chance to work with you and contribute. Okay. I have a Welsh accent from Pittsburgh. I've been in Pittsburgh 27 years, but I haven't lost the accent. And actually, I don't feel an exile at all. I grew up in a Welsh mining village next to a steel town. So Pittsburgh's like going home. And it's become a second home. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you both. It was a pleasure working with you on the book. And my only one complaint, at one point, the title got slightly mangled and it became the crisis of global governance. And I called Michael very quickly and said, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the crisis of governance at the national level. Next slide, please. Okay, so I go to my first slide. And I'm going to focus on the Northern Triangle. But the basic theme is that we're seeing, and a lot of people have talked about this, and a lot of my thinking goes back to Jim Rosenow in a book he did came out in 1990 called Turbulence in World Politics, where he talked about the crisis of state authority. And I think we've seen a lot since then that fits. And Rosenow in that book also talked about the two worlds of world politics, what he called the state-centric and the multi-centric. And then argued that in some ways these were competing, in some ways cooperating. And if you haven't read that book, I urge you to go back to it. There are sections of that book that still remain, I think, a superb framework for thinking about many of the things that we have, many of the challenges we're faced with. So I would argue we're facing long-term governance at the state level. This is pretty widespread. It's acute and it's spreading. What's been striking about the current election campaign in the United States is how many traditional norms, if not explicit rules, have been violated in all sorts of ways. And now we're seeing the legitimacy of the election itself being challenged in certain ways. This is, I think, a deplorable development, one that I think has very worrying implications for what happens after the election. So, but in some ways, also what we see, and I run a class I'm doing a capstone seminar on Central America, and we were talking about people being marginalized, excluded, in a sense. And this is what you've got, and this is what's being appealed to in some of the election campaign. And so, in some ways, and this is a kind of controversial claim, I'm sure, but the United States is not as far removed from Central America and the Northern Triangle as we would like to think it is. So that's the kind of starting point. And I want to suggest that this is exacerbated by global megatrends. And I will talk briefly about some of those megatrends. I'm currently working with Colin Clark from RAND, and we're doing a project for the NIC trying to think about transnational organised crime 10 years out. And so we've got to think not only about the past of megatrends, but about the future. Although I'll keep those very short for this. And then that finally has implications for how we think about territorial space, governance and conflict. And I'll put a couple of slides up at the end where I'll suggest a framework that I would argue is as relevant to Central America as it is to Syria, places like Syria and Iraq, what we see in these. So, next slide, please. So I want to start with this proposition that when we think about it, relatively few states are actually Westphalian. If you think about 40 to 100 to 20% in the global system, that's probably being generous. Sovereignty in many cases is little more than attractive fiction. And in a very interesting study that was done, I think about 25 years ago by Rob Jackson, he talked about many states actually being quasi-states. That they had the external formalities of sovereign, but they could not exercise real sovereignty. And I don't think that's changed for many states in Africa and even some in Latin America. I don't think that's changed a great deal. And if we think about this globally, we've often thought about weak states or failing states as the anomaly. Maybe it's legitimate and effective states are the real anomaly. And I think that's a reversal of our thinking that we need to be giving more attention to. Where the Westphalian state did develop, it developed as a result of this interaction between war-making and state-making. The famous sociologist Charles Tilly has written some superb things on this, where he argues that in a sense, the state was the most developed form of organised crime, and it turned extortion into taxation. Well, what we're seeing is organised crime currently fighting back, and in some cases actually providing governance. I agree with everything Deputy Hollis actually said, but I do think sometimes our law enforcement successes create real challenging governance, because sometimes it's the traffickers who provide governance, particularly at the local level where the state is absent. But in Latin America and in Africa, you didn't have that advantage of fighting large wars, which led to a centralized state of bureaucracy. And then in the aftermath of those wars, led to the development of a welfare state, almost as a reward for the citizens who've made such sacrifices, particularly in the First and Second World Wars. Next slide, please. So this is what we're dealing with. And I actually sent this sent a copy of the chapter for this book to General McMaster, and he particularly liked the paragraph that embodied these ideas. And I think in many ways it tries to capture it. It's not failing states. We have actually very few failing states. It's these perennially weak states that we have to worry about. And part of the problem is that this, in too many cases, is the way the elites want it. The state is a resource. It gives you enormous power if you control it. And it's also something that's lootable. And I think one of the people who's written most effectively on this is Sarah Shays. I remember a few years ago talking at the Marshall Center, and she was talking about the ISAF view of Afghanistan. And her point was most states talk about Afghanistan as a weak state. And she said, in one respect, it's very strong. And that is in acquiring and bringing up to the center the rents, the corruption payments. And I think she had a very important point there. Next slide, please. And this is, talking of Sarah Shays, this is something she said, and I think it's a very important comment, and makes us think very differently about the state. And in some cases, what you see is the state even using organized crime as an instrument. And we've seen Russia doing this, and we've seen Russia doing it in current context in relation to cybercrime. And I think in many ways the state in Latin America suffers from some of these deficiencies, right? And I went to something where John Booth, who's done, I think, one of the best textbooks on Central America called Understanding Central America, now in his 6th edition. And John started his comments with the idea that you're not going to get fundamental reform in Central America unless you get an elite transplant. Next slide, please. So these are the megatrends. And many of them have been around for a long time, so there's nothing new. Thinking about globalization, I think it's all about the density, speed, and ease of global transactions and global flows of every kind. In the paper we're doing, but I didn't do it here, we actually have anti-globalism as a new and emerging megatrend. And I think the question for the future is, will globalization be consolidated? Will it continue but be stuttering? Or in some ways, as we saw with Brexit and as we've seen in the current election campaign, will some of the people roll it back? Because I think there are two conceptions of the state and borders and everything else at work here. So I think that's a problem. The other problem, I would argue, is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has justified the retreat of the state. Because the state, the basic tenet of neoliberalism is the state should get out of the way and let the market operate. And markets do not operate as effectively we would like. This is not a particularly popular thing to say. It flies in the face of a lot of economic orthodoxy. But the Keynesian state and notions of protecting and supporting and helping its citizens had a lot going for it in the way that the neoliberal state does not. And one of the problems about this, it is never or rarely discussed in the national security world. It gets a lot of discussion by sociologists and anthropologists. We even talked about the neoliberal city, where public spaces have been commercialized, and people who used to use those public spaces pushed out and marginalized. So where are we going with globalization, I think, is up in the air. Population growth, we're talking about going up to about 9 billion people by 2050. The increased pressure on resources is enormous. Same with climate change. There was a study came out, I think, actually yesterday, by the UN about how climate change will impinge on food security. And that's the problem. When people talk about these megatrends or drivers, we see them in individual silos. They actually interact in some very complex way. And in some cases, the interaction exacerbates the challenges they pose. Sometimes it can mitigate, but often it can challenge. And I think climate change is one of those very challenging things. Urbanization is the other one. We see in more megacities. We have, I think, about well over 40 megacities with populations over 10 million people. We have a number over 20 million people. And that is fine in the developed world, but it doesn't work so well in the developing world. And so you're going to get different kinds of cities. And I have a piece coming out with the Army, with SSI, at the Army War College, with a co-author, Warner Seller, and we actually looked at military contingencies in megacities. And we draw a distinction between smart cities, which you're going to get in the developed world, fragile and feral cities, and the feral cities concept goes back to, I think, 2004, where the concept was developed by, I'm blanking on the name, of the author of the Naval War College. And the problem or the point about fragile cities, they can tip positively and become smart cities, or they can tip negatively and become feral cities. Then you've got the rise of violent non-state actors. I think we're all aware of that. And then conflict and their aftermaths. Think about the conflict in Syria. Think about the migration flows and refugee flows it's caused. And think about the level of stability in Egypt. Right? And there you're talking about a country with a much higher population and the potential to make the current migration crisis look minor in comparison. If you get violence and instability at a high level of it in Egypt, and the kind of thing in Syria replicating itself in Egypt. And then, so you get migration flows. Very interesting, again, in light of the election campaign, something out yesterday about how the majority of migrants coming to the United States are now from Central America and from the Northern Triangle. And the Mexican flow has actually been diminishing since the early 2000s, although one would never believe it to hear some of the rhetoric. And if I'm being, it's not I'm partisan, but if some of this is directed at a candidate, that's fine from my perspective. Then the decline of the rule of law and social enemy. Again, we think about this from our own perspective. When you look around the world, most countries are lawless. They have high levels or many countries, not most, but many countries are very lawless, have lawless areas, high levels of violence, and a degree of social enemy. My favorite example of this was in Mexico. In 2010, one of the gangs in Ciudad Juarez burst into a house where a party was going on. There were 15 or 16 kids, all good at school, scholars, athletes. None was involved with the drug business. One hid, and he had a chilling story that he told Alfredo Cachado. He said that one of the men said, "We're in the wrong place, let's leave." And another one of the gunmen replied, "We're here now, let's do it anyway." That is social enemy, a degeneration of norms and standards. Next slide, please. So the crisis of governance, I call it peace text, right? The anorexic state in particularly the Northern Triangle, no tax base, about 10, 11%. Rapid unplanned urbanization, and it's become the space of flows. Strategic location for cocaine flows. High levels of inequality. Again, it fits in terms of the enemy. Technology. The biggest technological development in the region has been cell phones, and what are these primarily used for? Extortion. And they've turned prisons into command and control authorities for many gangs. Doug might correct me on this, but I think he'd probably agree. And then we have the external factors, US deporting gang members and Mexican drug trafficking organizations also expanding into Mexico. Next slide, please. How am I doing, Hillary, for time? Okay. Repatriation of gang members to countries which lack the infrastructure to accept them. So I think that was important. And then in the Northern Triangle, it became a substitute for both the family and the state, if you like. And then we have this development of prisons. Next slide. And then the Mexican drug trafficking organizations, my friend Bruce Bagley at the University of Miami calls this the cockroach effect. I actually disagree. I think what we saw was the Sinaloa Federation and the Zetas both moving in to Central America as part of a strategic calculation. It was not they were being pushed out of Mexico. They moved in to get control of the supply lines earlier, and there was a competitive dynamic between them. And then Sinaloa, I think, still has a presence. The Zetas still have some, but the Zetas, very interestingly, created such violence and mayhem that the Guatemala state confronted them directly and actually pushed them out by 2013, in large part. Not least because other criminal organizations had also ganged up with the state against the Zetas, and they arrested El Tigre, one of their main local allies. Next slide, please. So again, I think you see this, right, and you start to see, if you map violence, I think you'd see that the big spike in violence comes as we start to get more and more of the cocaine going through Central America. Next slide. So here's my spaces, so I'll just 2 more minutes. So one of the things I think all this creates, these drivers, is different kinds of spaces in countries, right? I think they create formally governed spaces, but also they're alternatively governed spaces. And one of the most interesting alternative governance in Guatemala was provided by the Lorenzana drug trafficking organization. They actually provided medical clinics, jobs, gifts at Christmas, flood relief. They were taken down. Great law enforcement success. But the state did not step in. So actually, we made the governance problem worse. So this is something where we've got to think about law enforcement versus governance as a trade-off. Because law enforcement successes can lead to governance deficits and governance failures. So that's above the line, the peaceful part, right? Either formally or alternatively governed. And then below the line, confrontational and contested. Confrontational where the state is fighting non-state, whether it's insurgency, or as in Guatemala, the Guatemalan state declared a state of emergency. Contested where it's non-state with each other. And that I thought, well, that's where I came to. But next slide. But then I thought that was not enough. And Desmond Arias has a great book coming out on hybrid governance. And he looks at 2 cities in Colombia, actually 2 districts in Medellin, 2 favelas in Rio, and 2 districts in Kingston. And what he finds is that you sometimes get the state and the criminal organizations working together and providing governance between them. And at the other level, you can have both contested and confrontational at the same time. So that red box is where they come together. And I think actually this is the slide. I think this applies to parts of the Northern Triangle, and you can move it from one level to another. But I think it's equally applicable to Syria and Iraq right now, because I think you've got all these spaces there. So next slide. Couple of quick implications. The dilemma, right? Drug trafficking, we don't want to say it, has lots of positive consequences. That's not to say that the costs don't outweigh the gains. They do, particularly in the United States, where you have now a heroin epidemic of heroin overdoses. But for many towns, even those in Central America, where drug trafficking is going through, it's brought prosperity. It's brought better schools. It's brought satellite television. So the question becomes, I think, a very different one from the usual one we think about. It becomes, how do we nudge non-state groups from being predatory and paternalistic to being less predatory and more paternalistic? Next slide. And I think there's some implications for the state. Governance is not a monopoly of the state. Think about it. The point's often made that the state gave up control over religious life at one time. Well, I think for the contemporary state to flourish, it needs to give up the notion that it has a monopoly of governance, because in too many cases, it is not doing very well with that. Next slide. Thank you. And I want to thank Scott Fisher at ISW Corporation, because they actually provided a kind of interesting contract and allowed me to work in any way I wanted. It started with looking at Honduras and went to Central America, and then I started listening to Doug Farrar, who's taught me pretty much everything I know about it. Thank you for listening.
Great, and now we'll hear from Rear Admiral Olson. For the tech folks, can you pull up his slides? Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Hillary, for your kind introduction. My role this afternoon is to briefly talk about the U.S. drug policy and how that's set up, and a little bit of the threat, which we're all pretty much aware of, I think, but just try to describe that and how we propose in the National Drug Control Strategy how to go forward with that. With this time of the day and the afternoon, I certainly do not want to spend a lot of time talking about drug policy, because I think the more interesting discussion is clearly from my distinguished panelists here and colleagues on the panel here. So let me go forward with that one. Next slide, please. Okay, just cover those things. And again, briefly, I won't get into all of these, but the top few are the most important ones to cover. So I think it's important to remind us that we're all on the same page regarding roles and responsibilities and what the strategy does for us. Next slide. From the Office of National Drug Control Policy in the United States, or sort of part of the Executive Office of the President, established in 1988 when we had a crack cocaine problem in our nation, and it was really brought forward. And President Reagan said, we got to do something about this and go forward. And that's where the Office of National Drug Control Policy was established and born. Our mission is real simple. Okay? The mission is to reduce illegal drug use and its consequences. Accomplishing that mission is significantly more difficult, as you all understand. So how do we do that? Very simply, the National Drug Control Office of National Drug Control Policy is not involved in operations. We are simply policy. We set the strategy. By law, we have to review and redraft, update the National Drug Control Strategy annually. Every year that's done. That's by law. So that's the major document that all the agencies try to follow. We follow that up with a budget, a consolidated budget. You have to have a budget that follows that and enforces and goes along the same lines as those things established in the drug control policy. And then we oversee and coordinate the implementation. And that is done through a number of ways. There's a number of goals and objectives in the strategy, and those are followed up. Next slide. So the National Drug Control Strategy, like I said, has a number of overarching goals and objectives. I list a number of those in there, some of the major ones in there. But specifically, it's about, in this administration's, in this president's strategy, it talks about addiction as a brain disease that can be prevented and treated. Okay? People with substance use disorders can recover, and the new criminal justice reforms can stop this revolving door of criminals going in and being incarcerated and then coming back out and going right into the same business and addiction levels. So the real thing is, how does this go to, and there's 113 different objectives that all the agencies handle in there. I'm not going to even start to go down any of those, but those are how we, from the Office of National Drug Control Policy, assess the work done by all the agencies going forward. So what does that mean about supply reduction? That's what we're all involved in. That's what we're most interested in. That's what we're talking about here, okay, today for the most part. And what can we do about that? Next slide. Well, let me jump into talk about the threat, okay, and then I'll go to the supply side part of it. Again, most of us are pretty familiar with this. It's a national security threat. We say that a lot. I don't think it really resonates with our Congress and with the higher people. We haven't really come to grasp, as we've discussed a little bit here, how that affects us and how to deal with it. But it is a national security threat for us and for our neighbors. There's many forms of income that these transnational criminal organizations use and get to exert their influence, their corruption, and their power. But in our hemisphere, a great preponderance of that is through drugs and the sale of drugs, the trafficking of drugs. They literally compromise legitimate economies, and in some places take over the economies of countries. The corruption is endemic, and it can and is coming to our country in the United States If we think that we're immune to that, you're putting your head in the sand. We have a serious problem with that in our country as well. The violence is extreme, and I would add to what Ms. Hollis mentioned, the corruption is more than just a greedy thing where someone is giving a corrupt official money. It is added to it the power and influence of that organization to say, okay, if you don't take the money, I'm going to kill your wife or your family as well. So it's deeper than just a surface level of greed. That's a part of our challenge, but that goes to the national security threat. Next slide, please. We've all seen slides like this. This is specifically cocaine-centric, focused flow out of, for our country, predominantly Colombia. 90% of our cocaine usage in this country comes from Colombia. And it shows various general routes that are used by the trafficking organizations. And it's a loose network of groups and organizations that profit and control the routes and make it happen. Now, we've been very successful in a number of those areas, but it is a route that various routes and organizations that continue to be enormously successful in moving drugs towards our country. In short, but the organized crime part of it, they transcend the cultures, the social, linguistic barriers, obviously the borders. If you look at any one of those and start peeling back the onion of those routes and how they work, they're either going far out to sea, they're using other deceptive methods, and I'll go into that. Next slide, please. I'll talk about that in a minute. But how do we counter that? Okay. From our national drug control strategy and from the National Interdiction Command and Control Plan, we use 4 different ways of specifically addressing that. And the basic principles we use are those listed here. Okay? We get to disrupt and dismantle and degrade those organizations. Again, easier said than done, but we have to take the organizations apart. It's not just about grabbing the drugs. Okay? We have to build capable international partners. Again, these are going through other countries. It's cut for the most part. The drugs are coming here. They do go to Europe. They go to Australia. They go to other places as well. But we're talking about a flow that predominantly comes to our country, to the United States. So we cannot just do it ourselves. We need to help those other countries, and we do. But they have to have the political will to stand up and make it happen as well. So that's a challenge that we can cooperate and build those partnerships and help each other on this going forward. We have to protect the global financial systems. It is global financial systems. As we all understand, it's very easy to transfer money internationally now and get it into the global system, and once it's there, it is much more difficult to trace. So how we go after the money is very, very important, and I'm glad to answer more questions on that one. But in a lot of respects, moving money, bulk cash, for example, is more difficult than moving drugs because it's bulky. It takes up a lot of space. So for the trafficker, they're vulnerable there, and we need to continue. Not that there isn't focus on that now, but there needs to be more and more focus on that aspect of our interdiction efforts. And as mentioned by Ms. Hollis, clearly we need to synchronize our efforts. And that means not just going after these on a case-by-case basis, whether it's a load of cocaine or it's some money here or it's a trafficker here or something else that's happening in a particular city around Chicago. It has to be much more coordinated effort, and that effort can really be more effective. I firmly believe that we can improve a lot if we synchronize our efforts. Next slide. So we've all known that these major trafficking routes that I mentioned before connect the drug producers with the drug users. All right, and they use all kinds of them. You can look at this slide. You got the one on the upper left there is our semi-submersible. Very tough to follow. Very tough to be able to even see them when they're out there. You can be within a mile of that vessel with a ship or an aircraft and not sight it at all. They are built that way, and they are very difficult to intercept. They've been very successful. The Super Pangas, long range, they need to be refueled sometimes, which the next slide over there shows, being refueled next to a fishing vessel. The long transit routes, however they use, of course they use containers as well, and that one picture shows unloading containers, and they fly it in, okay? In addition to a myriad of other methods, okay, from body cavity carriers to throwing them on commercial airlines and on and on. The fact of the matter is it's easy to hide and tough for law enforcement to interdict those. Even though the interdiction levels have been very successful, in fact one of the most successful years ever this past year in interdiction efforts, there's still greater volumes that are coming in, and that's a challenge for law enforcement. Add to that, the traffickers change. If we take a route away from them, they move. And a perfect example through history, it takes a number of years to see that, but in the 1980s, there was 75% of the cocaine coming to the U.S. in the 1980s was coming through the Caribbean. Nowadays, it's 80% in the Eastern Pacific and then through Central America. So it's completely changed the routes coming into the U.S. And if we're going to be successful down the road, we should expect that they're going to change again because they're going to move their routes around. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, cannot emphasize this too much. Partnerships are key. They're absolutely essential if we're going to be successful against drug traffickers. These are just a few of the world or international organizations that we work with and cooperate with, and part of my role at the Office of National Drug Control Policy is to work within the international community at this level. And it requires then, in addition to that, going to bilateral meetings with specific countries, as the Coast Guard does a whole bunch, CBP does, State Department does a whole bunch of those as well. That is important, but even go more to the regional level. Because a drug trafficker is skirting within the territorial waters, going from Panama to Costa Rica to Nicaragua on up, we should not just be frustrated by watching them go. We need to have a cooperative effort together to be able to interdict them. When one country has the asset or another country may not be able to respond, we should be able to work those things together. That becomes a very political issue because us operating, the U.S. operating in their territorial waters or vice versa, those agreements are very difficult to work out for political reasons and security reasons. So building that trust and confidence to have the international partnerships that we need to be really successful is essential if we're going to win and control this drug threat against our country. And it is that. I think I'll leave it at that. Next slide, please. And be glad to answer any questions anyone may have. Thank you.
I'm actually going to take the questions all for the panel at the end, if that's all right with you, sir.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Over to you, Doug.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here on this panel, and thank you, Michael and Hillary, for a great job in editing the book. And I wanted to talk a little bit about something I put in my chapter, and I'm still wrestling with how to define, and it goes a little bit to what Dastine Hollis said earlier about needing to look at networks as opposed to commodities. And one of the things I'm finding in my research and what I wrote the chapter on, I'm still refining it, like I'm not entirely happy with it, but it's the concept of criminalized states. which is different in the way I try to define it from normally corrupt states where you have pieces of the state corrupted and you get a border agent to let you cross, you let a judge let you go, you get a cop to tell you where you're going. Differentiating that from states that actually participate as partners in transnational organized crime and use transnational organized crime and terrorist groups as instruments of foreign policy or instruments of state policy going forward in the Western Hemisphere. And I think that to me, one of the things that caught my attention was when I was at the Marshall Center and with General Breedlove, and he talked about how we look at Russia and we think, oh, Russia's trying to sort of play the game a little differently. They're changing around the edges. And he says essentially, they're not playing the same game we're playing. We're playing soccer and they're playing basketball, and we think that they should be abiding by the rules of our game, but they're playing an entirely different game. And I think in Latin America, there's some truth to that with what the Bolivarian movement has been doing and what states that participate with organized crime as partners, and where the state can direct transnational organized crime and benefit from it, is essentially looking at an entirely different ballgame. They're not playing by rules that we would consider to be democratic or ways that we thought the OAS had created a democratic charter, which most countries were trying to abide by in some fashion. Instead, they're playing an entirely different game in which the state, and I struggle with the term criminalized states, because if you look at if a state makes it legal in what they're doing, if Venezuela decides that it's okay to use FARC-produced cocaine to generate revenue and allow that cocaine to pass through, then for the Venezuelan government, that's not a criminal act. That's a consensual act between that government and the FARC, that government, and the trafficking organizations moving it forward. So maybe criminalized isn't the right word, but it's an entirely sort of different range of activities in which the state provides its resources and its backing to go forward. And one of the things I spent a lot of time looking at is resource flows into these states, and trying to figure out what makes these resources flow you see coming out of Venezuela, PDVSA, into groups like Albanisa in Nicaragua, into Alba Petróleos in El Salvador, and then you have an entirely sort of different set of commodities moving through places like Suriname where the state is co-participating. And it's fascinating because there's a sort of the same modality to much of what they do, which is only possible because the state is a willing partner in making this happen. And one of the things I think is fascinating is looking at the projects that governments announce that they are going to carry out as illicit money flows in, or unexplained or unmonitored money flows in. So if you look at Albanisa in Nicaragua, it's set up along with Alba Petróleos in El Salvador to receive Venezuelan oil at a discounted rate. They pay for half of it up front at a discounted rate, and they're supposed to pay the other half of it back over a 22-year period at 1% interest or something like that. So when we looked at Alba Petróleos in El Salvador, which started with $1 million, these are all of the figures that they themselves use, and working in support of a project we were doing with Dasdy's office. If you look at everything that Venezuela was supposed to be giving them, oil, and if they sold that at $100 a barrel, they could generate, in theory, about $200 million a year in Alba Petróleos. But if you look at what they actually generate, they went from $1 million starting capital in 2007 to, by 2013, $863 million. 2014, they announced they had hit $1 billion. And if you juxtapose that, I didn't bring a slide that's in the book. If you juxtapose that with the amount of oil coming in from Venezuela and the falling oil prices, they're going in diametrically opposite directions. So if you look at the gap between what they could in theory produce, if everything went perfectly well, and what they actually produce, you can pretty much come to the conclusion that there's about $800-900 billion million in unexplained revenues flowing through their system at that point. Where exactly it comes from, it's not entirely possible to say. I think we have some pretty good ideas of where it comes from. And Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua has announced that Albanisa provides him personally with $500 million to $600 million a year. What does this mean? That means that 22% of the Nicaraguan budget does not pass through the Congress at all. It's not approved. There's no oversight or anything related to oversight of that money. It's his personal slush fund. If you look at Alba Petróleos in El Salvador, it's 24% of their national budget that does not pass through any allocation process at all, in which there is no oversight. So how do they move this money into the legal realm? And this is what I found so interesting. And look at this because there's a pattern to it. My favorite one is the giant oil refinery that Daniel Ortega and Hugo Chavez announced in 2008 that they were going to build in Nicaragua, called El Sueño Supremo de Bolívar. It was going to refine Venezuelan oil in Nicaragua for further export, and they, in their initial price tag for this magnificent project, was $4.6 billion. Okay, so every time I go to Nicaragua, I go to look at the Sueño Supremo de Bolívar and see exactly what's happening, and every time the answer is exactly nothing. They have a few rusty tanks in a falling down fence and one guard. Yet every year, in their announcement of how it's going, they allocate another $200, $300 million toward the Sueño Supremo de Bolívar. Right now, they've spent about $650 million essentially on an empty field. Rather fantastic development. But why can they do that? Because by announcing that the project exists and announcing that resources are going through it, they have laundered that money simply by declaring it because they're the state. The Attorney General is not going to investigate it. The Treasury is not going to investigate it because the President has declared it's going to be so. And Alba Petróleos does exactly the same thing. José Luis Merino, who runs Alba Petróleos, and multiple other figures announced last year that they were going to invest $465 million in this magnificent alternative energy project that was going to provide massive alternative energy across Central America. So far, they have done zero. There's no trace of that project existing anywhere, doing anything. And yet, that money is now legitimized as it flows into the system. So I think what I'm trying to get at in my own writing and thinking is what changes, when does a state become cross whatever threshold? You have different degrees of criminalization across. I think Ecuador is significantly less criminalized, even though it's part of the Bolivarian nation, than Venezuela was. I think there's a state that's further criminalized than Venezuela is, and I would offer, and I've just been looking at this, and I think it's fascinating, and that's the state of Suriname. One of the things, as Asti said, you have to look at multiple, not just the cocaine or drug flows anymore. In Suriname, it's multiple things, but the primary one I'm looking at now is gold. And if you look at the flows of gold through the region, we've been doing a lot of work looking at production and exports. Most countries now, many countries in South America now export more gold than they produce, which is kind of hard to do. But yet most of them, from Peru to Colombia to Ecuador to Bolivia, all manage this magnificent feat. But what struck me as I was looking at the gold was that there's one company that come up a refinery, Kaladi Gold, that people related to the FARC were talking about, people related to the FARC Central American structures were talking about, and some of my investigators said, what do you know about something called Kaladi? And I said, I know nothing. I have never heard of Kaladi. So it turns out that Kaladi is one of the major gold buyers in the world, based in the United Arab Emirates, but they were forming something in Suriname called the Kaladi Suriname Mint House. So I was looking at that and thought that's kind of an interesting thing. And then when I read in the Surinamese press that it was going to be the largest gold refinery in the Western Hemisphere, that made me sort of sit up and note, because one of the things I like to do in my research is figure out what doesn't make sense. And the fact that Suriname, on the northern coast of South America, that speaks Dutch and is completely isolated virtually from the rest of the hemisphere, would think that it was going to have, that people were going to ship gold to them to be refined, was preposterous. They have no comparative advantage in any sense. They don't have any airlines that fly in there except a few from the Caribbean. They don't have advantageous shipping routes. They don't have advantageous land routes. They got nothing. And they can't move their gold once it's refined anyplace else because they have no outbound flights. So I thought, well, this is an interesting anomaly here. So I went to Suriname to look at their refinery and try to figure out what was going on. And sure enough, this Kaladi Suriname Mint House exists. I drove by it a few times. It's completely empty, locked up, surrounded by machine guns, but no cars, no nothing. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Maybe I came at the wrong time of day. So I went back in the afternoon instead of the morning. Nothing was going on, nothing going on in the evening. So I started talking to the gold exporters who were legitimate gold exporters. And I said, what about this refinery? And they said, refinery? And I said, the Kaladi Suriname, they've announced it 1 million times. They said, there is no refinery. It doesn't exist. It simply exists on paper. Who's the president of Suriname? Desi Bouterse. What do we know about Desi Bouterse? One, he's a convicted drug trafficker. Two, he has a long-standing relationship with the FARC trading weapons for cocaine that goes back to the 1990s. His son is a convicted drug trafficker spending most of the rest of his life in prison in the United States. And his son was the head of Suriname's counterterrorism unit, but had also been thrown out of Brazil when he was a diplomat in his father's earlier political career as president because he was using the diplomatic pouch to move cocaine. So it's an interesting family. Most of the rest of the family is somewhat involved. And it turns out, in digging through the paperwork around the Kaladi Suriname Mint House, that Desi Bouterse personally owns 30% of the enterprise. Surinamese state owns 10% of the enterprise, and Kaladi owns 40% of the enterprise. Why is this interesting? Because gold can move around the world. Unless it's 99% pure, it doesn't have to be declared as a financial instrument. Most gold, and I went out to the fields in Suriname to watch them make it, by the time they dig these giant pits and smelt it down, and you come up with a little thing of gold like that, that's 95% pure. You can stick that in your pocket and walk into Miami and not declare it, and nothing will happen to you. If you have 99% gold and you don't declare what it's going to happen, you may get fined, nothing else. You can't determine the origin of the gold once it's moved. And what is the groups, the Bakrim and the FARC in specific areas in Colombia are finding? That it's 19 times more profitable to go into the mining sector than it is to go into the coca trade. Why? That's being the low end where they don't get much money for the coca they produce. It's zero risk. So you're going to make more money, and you're not doing anything illegal in any particular sense. And yet that money flows out through places like Suriname, which what I found so interesting about it is that they built their refinery, in theory, the refinery doesn't exist on paper, to refine 40 tons of gold a year. Suriname at best produces 11 tons. So let's say you have a 29% gap in surplus capacity that you'd be filling by everybody in the world wanting to fly to Suriname to refine their gold, because we know that that's actually what would have to happen, right? Essentially, they're putting on paper enormous exportations of gold that don't exist, which means that they're moving an unbelievable amount of money around the world to a company, a refinery, that offers essentially banking services. So you can, if you put your money with Kaladi or your gold, you can withdraw that gold as cash virtually anywhere in the world. It's set up to operate as a bank. So if Suriname produces 5 tons of gold, and the president decides that if you're willing to pay for the laundering services to launder another 15 tons of gold, the amount that would be 15 tons of gold, you simply put it on paper and move it out. This is the beauty of having state participation. And that's what I think differentiates it from places like Mexico, I was going to say El Salvador, less and less from El Salvador, maybe Guatemala, Belize, places that have severe corruption problems, but where the state is not actively looking for criminal partners that will allow them to make money. And why is this so? I mean, who the hell would go to Suriname to commit crime, right? I've been there a couple times. It's not an easy place to get to and not a delightful place to be when you're there. But why would you go there? Because you have absolute stability. What do both criminal and illicit enterprises want? Predictability and stability. So if you know, and this is, I think, what Daniel Ortega has done so well in Nicaragua as well, if you know that if you pay a certain percentage and you're going to get the protection you want and the services you need, even if you're in a not very pleasant place like Paramaribo, that's a great place to be, because who is going to raid your offices? Who's going to check your invoices? Who's going to see if there's actually any gold going through a non-existent gold refinery? Nobody, because you have the state protection. So that's what I tried to get at in my chapter, and I think that it applies. The concept of criminalized states first sort of came to me when I was when I was living in West Africa and covering Charles Taylor, and I think that the model or the concept is applicable in a broader area outside of Latin America, because when I was doing Charles Taylor work, everybody at the top of the list of ungoverned or failed states was Liberia was there, and I was spending a lot of time in Liberia, and I thought, yeah, this is a failed state. You're right. And I thought after a while, this isn't a failed state at all. Charles Taylor is doing exactly what he wants with the state. He's just decided to run it as a criminal enterprise instead of a Westphalian proposition where the goods of the people are primary. And I think underlying all of this, and I'll finish with this, underlying this sort of the Bolivarian movement of money and what they're doing, I think is a desire to create an alternative reality in Latin America, which in some ways one could say, okay, that's great, that's laudable, but I think that if the rules of the game are such that you can use what we would call, they wouldn't call this, criminal proceeds to achieve your goals, then you have an entirely different type of state than if you have what we would call a liberal democratic state, right? If you view FARC revenue from cocaine as a legitimate source of income from your government, then you're dealing with the FARC as an entirely different proposition from a drug trafficking group that has committed a lot of human rights abuses and only wants to seek power in Colombia. I think there is, and a lot of people don't agree with me, I think there is a strong ideological component still valid in the Bolivarian structure. I think that they view the revolution as needing the resources they can generate. And in my conversations with people, particularly in El Salvador, that are participating in this activity, or did participate in the early days when the Communist Party of the FMLN was absolutely adamant on carrying out a series of kidnappings and other things right after the war ended in El Salvador, like, what the hell are you doing? Like, the war's over, right? People have gone off to their new life. And the answer was no. The revolution, we're in a pause in the revolutionary structure, and we need resources, which is why parts of the FMLN eventually could go into first kidnapping, then drug trafficking, as do parts of the Contras, as do parts of the Sandinistas. And I want to also clarify, I don't think that this is a left-right divide. I don't think this is the Bolivarian as a leftist movement, or the fact that the Communist Party in El Salvador is very active in this. I think it's because you can have, as Uruguay, as Chile, as Brazil have shown, democratically elected governments on the left who play by the rules and do exactly what they're supposed to do, and when they lose the elections, they go home, right? They're not part of the Bolivarian concept. I think the radical populist Bolivarian concept, I think, is different from what Bachelet's socialism in Chile is about, or whatever. So I think it often comes across like, oh, it's a left-right thing, and the right did. No. The right was massively corrupt, in particularly places like El Salvador. I think that the FMLN is setting new records and making the areneros look like pikers. They didn't really know how to steal from the state. Anastasio Somoza was certainly corrupt, and the Sandinistas in this iteration are showing that he had no vision at all about how to actually strip a state of all its assets, right? This is a really new thing. I think in Argentina, the same thing. Cristina was not a self-declared Bolivarian, but she managed to ransack a country from top to bottom over a period of 11 years in ways that make everybody else look really small-minded, right? She had a great vision of where she was going. So I think that the level of state participation and state outreach and state use of criminal organizations and terrorist organizations as instruments of policy, and the willingness to put the state I wouldn't say at the service of these groups, I'd say a mutually beneficial relationship where everybody profits, sets this phenomenon a little bit apart. And I think what makes Suriname even more interesting is that it's really a vertically integrated operation. And I think that's due in part to the size of the nation. It's very small. There's a small population, small territory to control in ways that Chavez, even when he was most popular, couldn't run a vertically integrated system in Venezuela because it's just simply too big for him. So I think that grappling with that on a policy level is incredibly difficult because we're only used to dealing with states as states and non-states as non-states. And if you're a state, then your passports are valid and whatever you do is within the state is fine. When in fact, many of these states don't view any of those rules as being particularly valid and are playing an entirely different game with entirely different objectives. And how we deal with that and figure out methodologies for segregating, dealing on a policy level, and understanding that what the differences are, I think, is incredibly challenging because we don't have a lot of instruments to deal with criminalized states. You can't say every Surinamese passport is invalid because the government is running a criminal enterprise. But do you also want them with equal right and equal vote in everything that happens in the region because you know that they're running a criminal enterprise? Probably not. So how do you get at that distinction? So that's a little bit about what the thinking in the chapter is, and I'll leave it there, and we can take questions and answers.
Great. So we've run a little bit over time. If anyone has any burning questions, I think we can take a handful in sort of one fell swoop and put them to our panel. If you have a question, if you could just raise your hand in the back. I'd ask that you identify yourself, who you work with, and then ask your question as succinctly as possible.
Gracias, muy buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Sara Lambertini, de la Misión Permanente de Venezuela ante la OEA. Y mi planteamiento es para el señor Douglas Farad. Él comenta que no se trata de derechas ni de izquierda, pero según su conferencia, pues en definitiva el movimiento bolivariano y todos los países que siguieron el movimiento bolivariano serían criminalizados, porque es lo que usted está señalando. Ahora, usted está desconociendo toda una cantidad de hechos que no son mentiras, como toda una cantidad de cosas que son los logros sociales que se han logrado con Alba Petrocaribe. Usted indicó que Albaniza no existe y que solo son unas tiendas o unas carpas, como lo señala usted. Sin embargo, eso dista mucho de la realidad. Albaniza es una de las empresas más importantes de toda Nicaragua. Y, insisto, está desconociendo toda una cantidad de logros sociales, como es el tema de alfabetismo, todo el tema de salud, todo el tema de educación que se hizo, que se ha hecho y se mantiene con Alba Petrocaribe. Entonces, no sabría decir de dónde sacó usted sus datos, cuando la realidad, y de hecho estoy pidiendo autorización para poderle enviar a usted los datos que nosotros manejamos en Alba Petrocaribe, para que pueda contrastarlos con lo que usted ha indicado. Muchas gracias.
Great. Does anyone else have questions? I think we can just take them as a group in the interest of time. Sir, in the center.
Good afternoon. Stephen Donahue from McClarty Associates. Thank you very much. One of the things that has been absent from the conversation thus far is the role of legitimate business in all of this that we've been talking about, and the impact of illicit trade and all of these illegal activities on regular businesses that are working within the system to try to build the economies of the countries. It'd be useful if at some point you would consider that and include business. There's an effort through the U.S. Chamber to try to deal with illicit trade, and think about business as a partner for governments in many of these activities.
Great, and I think we can take one final question if there's anyone else with a burning desire. Yes, ma'am.
Jill Germano, Treasury Department Chair at the National War College. My question is for Admiral Olson. A number of economists have recommended moving away from cash or de-emphasizing cash, beginning with large denomination bills to take those out of circulation. Would that actually make the bulk cash problem harder for the networks, or would it make things more difficult for us as they inevitably adapted? Thank you.
And before I turn it over to our panelists to address those questions, to the gentleman with the question about licit and illicit trade networks, I would advise that you look at Karl Lallerstedt's chapter in our book where he addresses that issue. But over to the panel.
Bueno, tal vez comienzo yo para responder. Yo no dije que no hacían nada. Yo dije que hay una falta de transparencia total en Albaniza y a ustedes les consta, como publicó Confidencial y otros, que ahí desapareció 3.5 mil millones de dólares. ¿Okay? Entonces, puede ser que hayan hecho cosas buenas, pero no sabemos porque no hay contabilidad ninguna en estos procesos, ni con Alba Petróleo. Entonces, Petrocaribe sí funcionó en la mayoría de los casos, sin duda. Pero lo que no funciona es ninguna posibilidad de que la gente sepa hacia dónde va el dinero o que tengan control de eso, que puedan monitorear eso o que puedan de alguna manera decir que no estamos conforme con eso. Entonces mi punto no es que no hayan hecho nada bueno, mi punto es que no tenemos la menor idea de realmente cómo se maneja ese dinero y a dónde se va y cómo se maneja. Entonces yo ahí lo dejo con mucho gusto. Si me quiere enviar algo, yo le dejo mi tarjeta y me puede enviar lo que le parezca. Yo creo que sí, en términos de izquierda-derecha, Alba, como entidad, el grupo de Alba se identificó como socialismo del siglo XXI. Obviamente se están autovistiéndose de un discurso de izquierda, sin duda. También hay otras clases de izquierda mucho más transparentes, mucho más dados a procesos democráticos y mucho más funcionales en términos de estados como Uruguay, como Chile, como Brasil, que no comparten el populismo radical que comparte la revolución bolivariana. Entonces, ellos se han autodenominado lo que ellos quieren, que son socialistas, excelente, pero también Michelle Bachelet es socialista y no comparte muchos de sus valores ni ese comportamiento. Entonces, ahí lo dejo. Gracias.
Let me
Would
take
you
that.
like to address the
I'll
question
jump into the
specifically?
answer there for the young woman there. I think we need to think through what we will drive the traffickers to. Clearly, on the short term, going to smaller bills or getting rid of the larger bills that are obviously just used for storage or for transfer or somehow movement of large amounts of money has some advantages. Okay, but what would we drive the traffickers to do? Electronic, you can transfer money on your phones now. We have to think through what we're going to drive them to. My opinion, and that's what it is only, is we need to walk through that and look ahead. Okay, look ahead at what our actions are going to drive the traffickers to. If we can drive them to doing something that we can take more advantage of in the future, and making sure we walk through that thought process. Simple answer, glad to discuss more. Thank you.
Quick point on the business. I don't think it's as clear-cut as that, because I don't think all business institutions have an interest in combating organised crime. Banks have had to be dragged, kicking and screaming, to be part of the anti-money laundering regime, and there are all sorts of defections from it periodically. 1.9 billion fine for HSBC, for example. You look at Lebanese Canadian Bank. You look at Wachovia before it went out of business. It's not a great record.
And then we'll close with just a handful of questions from our web audience. The first question is Wilmer from Panama, who asks, how can a state relinquish governance? Doesn't this imply entering into a type of anarchy or letting go of rule of law as we understand it? And also Julio Romero Orozco from Chile, who asks, is it not the new socio-political reality with web and internet communication that there is an asymmetry with the state which looks to be in a constant state of change? So if any of you have a brief comment on those very insightful questions.
I didn't quite get the first question, but I think it was about how do states give up governance without giving up law and order? I think the idea is shared governance, right? And I think it's states do not do it themselves very effectively in too many cases. So if other groups come in and do it, that in governance terms is a plus. The fact that some of those governance groups do a lot of bad things at the same time creates a set of dilemmas. And I just don't think we've acknowledged those dilemmas yet.
I think the second question about being in a constant state of change is also true. I think we're entering a new world, and I think Phil Williams has been doing this longer than I have, I'm happy to say, has really been sort of pioneering in looking at how the world, the concept of state, what a state is changing, and the concept of governance, and how all of these things interplay. So I think that as you look at asymmetry, or how non-state actors gain and go from power, or rise and fall in power, it's really important to think about what is really important. And is it as you talk about in Central America with the Bolivares, is it very important to have a narco group bringing stability and some economic benefit to a group, or as we've seen in Honduras, where the DEA has gone in and done a very effective job of decapitating most of the transportation networks, and who's risen to take their place? The gangs. So now you have MS-13, which wasn't involved much in actual transporting of cocaine until fairly recently, now stepping up because they're positioned to do that. So we got rid of one problem, very good for law enforcement, and probably good in many ways for the Honduran state. But the next step of the gangs coming in and now being much more well-financed and much more able to develop a political agenda and do all the things they're doing is entirely an unexpected consequence of a very successful program by the state. So I think states have to be aware, we have to be aware of what the state is changing and how the non-state actors are changing and what the correlation of forces is actually optimal, and it may not be the getting rid of all the criminal groups at once, which would lead to collapse.
For your attention, and with the end of the question and answer period, we'll now have a stand-in-place break as the second panelists come up to the stage. Thank you.
No, for the slides.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll take your seats, we're about to resume. Do you need some? Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're about to resume with panel 2. Ladies and gentlemen, please have a seat, and we will resume with panel 2. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So I'll let you know when, and maybe we can get together then. Okay, panel 2 is about to begin. Thank you for taking your seats. If any of you had a problem with the Spanish translation, it is on channel H. So, panel 1 described some of the challenges and the threats that we face throughout the hemisphere. Professor Williams described the way that governments are challenged, the way that they're having trouble meeting the challenges, the problems of governance at the state level. Admiral Olson described the scourge that drug trafficking is, described it as a national security threat. And if we think it's a national security threat here in the United States, try to empathize with those leading other countries, what a security threat it is to them. And Doug Farah described the collusion between insurgents, former insurgents, drug traffickers, money launderers, and criminalized states, which emphasizes or reinforces the comment that I made earlier, which is that we are not immune. Even here in the safety of the Western Hemisphere, far removed from ISIL and Syria and Iraq and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, we are still vulnerable. We're threatened, but we're not helpless. And this second panel, I hope, will show that there are things that we can do. There are methods and techniques that we can marshal to meet these challenges. We'll begin with Christopher Fussell, who was on the team in Iraq that brought together all the resources necessary and changed the operating methods in order to defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Since then, he's applied some of those methods, innovative bureaucratic methods, in the business sector in the United States, and he's co-author of the book Team of Teams. Claire Lockhart, who is a co-author of an article on state building in this seminal book, and also co-author of another book, along with the current president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, of the seminal book Fixing Failed States. We'll speak about the state building enterprise. And finally, Selena Rioluyo, who's professor of practice here at the Perry Center at National Defense University, and one of the preeminent experts on counter-terrorist finance, is going to speak about public-private partnerships and the threat posed in the Western Hemisphere by the Islamic State. And we'll follow the same protocol with each of the speakers speaking about 10 to 15 minutes. If we move to the right a little bit, I hope you'll indulge us. It's an interesting discussion. And then we'll follow that with questions, answers, and further discussion. Okay? All right. Let's go first to you. Mr. Fussell.
Thank you. So great to be here. I will represent some of the story from the special operations community going through this transition. As you said in the opening, my background is in the SEAL team, so I was in the U.S. Navy for about 15 years, from 1997 until 2012. I spent the majority of that time, about 10 years or so, inside the task force that was specifically leveraged against the fight against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda is a global insurgency, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and then has obviously spread since that time. So my battlefield experience stops in 2012, but then have transitioned a lot of those lessons over to other sectors. which I'm happy to talk more about. The punchline there on the aftermath, post-military, is that whether you're in or out of uniform, every sector that we encounter is wrestling with some version of this issue, which is the transition from sort of the industrial age into modern warfare and industry, sort of the modern communication structures that make the external environment so much more complex, I would argue, than the systems were designed to handle going back 100 or so years. The military obviously has its own lineage in that process, as does industry, as does government, as do, I would argue, all big systems, healthcare, education, et cetera. So there's some smart folks in all these spaces grappling with a lot of these same problems. I'll walk through some images here to sort of set the stage. Try to keep the comments short because I'd love to get to your thoughts and questions. So next slide, please. So another tribute to our Welsh thinkers around the world. This is a version of the Kinnaman model designed by David Snowden, a org thinker. His argument, this is based on a Harvard Business Review article that he wrote years ago, saying that there's basically 4 quadrants that a leader should put themselves in mentally in any environment, and they know how to adjust their behaviors as a leader accordingly. And so I've gotten to know David since got out of the service, and have applied, some of this is in the book, have applied this at an organizational level to how organizations need to index themselves against the environment they find themselves in. And part of the large argument that we're making in the book Team of Teams was that the world, and especially on the battlefield, with the arrival of the information age and the exponential growth in the speed of information flows and the connectivity between individual actors on the battlefield, we've fundamentally shifted from a complicated into a complex environment, or a predictable into unpredictable environment. So next build, please. So this concept of ordered versus disordered, I think, is critical in today's discussion. Next slide, please. Or fundamentally shifting from predictable to unpredictable. Next build, please. So that the whole concept of the models on the left that we all grew up inside of and have refined to great effect over the last 100 years or so were in many ways built on the idea that the external environment is predictable. Why? Because you tend to be playing a balanced game. I mean, this is obvious to military thinkers, a little less so, interestingly, in industry where we do a lot of work now. The thought that we're all smart people and we work really hard, but the game is fundamentally balanced, which introduces all sorts of assumptions that you can make as a leadership team to how you pass information, the speed at which you need to make decisions. Concepts of decentralization are much different, obviously, in the left model than in the right. When hierarchies are fighting hierarchies, when there's a balanced effort, then everyone essentially is following the same rules, and the rules have been universally created for the last 120 years, or further back, depending on how far you want to go. We picked up the argument at the transition into the Industrial Revolution, but these models aren't new, obviously. I mean, militarily, you can map the Roman legions to that same model. Now, when we took that system, and part of the interesting, I think, history inside the special operations community was because of the type of individuals, the authorities that units would get, the funding that you would have, we tended not to think of ourselves in that structure. You thought of yourselves as this highly agile unit that could break the rules of the big bureaucracy. It was true to a certain extent, but it was actually, in retrospect, true at a small unit level, not at the enterprise level. What we missed was the transition into a reality where these small units would have to connect as an enterprise. So I'm happy to dive into that a little more. But the eye-opening for us was the systems on the right, the encountering distributed networks. Next slide, please. So everyone here, I'm sure, remembers Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the very front-facing leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Brief history, if you don't recall, Jordanian-born, pretty intense fighter, very, very public in in the way he presented himself in order to drive his strategy, recruit more folks, etc. He felt like we need a very charismatic leader in front, and he was willing to do that, knowing full well that he was shortening his days on the battlefield, but he had an effective strategy in place, which was, I will introduce so much violence between Sunni and Shia that the system will essentially collapse and will withdraw. Because he was so vocal and so present as a leader, our assumption, our Western bias, was he must have built out some sort of model like this underneath him. Because traditionally, if you're going to build an effective insurgency that scales, which al-Qaeda in Iraq certainly looked like it was, The way to do that was to build this sort of model underneath you. The good insurgents know how to control their information flows. They know how to stay in the shadows, all the things we learn when we study insurgencies. So our assumption was if we study it long enough, if we go out and hit enough targets, eventually we'll find the secret documents that show us the red line bureaucracy, and then we can fight it on our terms. We'll expose it before it wants to be exposed. Next slide, please. What we learned the hard way, next slide, please, was he had actually built this sort of model. I would say unintentionally. I don't think Zarqawi was an insurgent genius. I think he was a bit of a thug who leveraged the right parts of the information age to just quickly scale an idea-based network, not any sort of organized system. Now, that to us, that felt before we recognized and were willing to admit the fact that we were fighting a network, it seemed like they've cracked some magic code here because they are aligned on purpose. And moving at an exponential rate compared to how fast we're able to move. So what are they doing differently? Now, in hindsight, I would say they were just injecting an idea and a belief system into an ever-scaling network without any worry about central controls. So Zarqawi was not overseeing this. He was a large node inside this distributed model, which we learned the hard way when he was removed from the battlefield, that the insurgency didn't go away. It just sort of morphed around it, as networks are apt to do. Next slide, please. And so back to this model, the Kinnaman model. Next slide, please. We found ourselves on this side of the system. And so our first reaction was we need to optimize that model because we had the hubris, as many do, that this model is good. We've refined it for generations to be the best thing on the battlefield. Therefore, if we can pull enough levers, if we can deploy enough forces, if we can get enough authorities, resources, etc., eventually we'll get ahead of this thing because the thing is not better than us. We're unwilling to even introduce that idea into the conversation, which can lead to all these second-order problems inside your own sort of model. You find the same thing in all sorts of big sectors right now. A lack of desire to really question the model itself. Instead, let's pull the levers that have worked for the last several generations. Next slide, please. And so we're sitting on the predictable, fighting the unpredictable. On the unpredictable side are these distributed networks and the occasional push up into just pure chaos. So the distinguishing there being, and Mr. Farah is still here. I've never given this discussion in front of a complexity theory network expert, so please forgive me if I missed that. But a network is the connection between cause and effect can only really be known in hindsight. It doesn't have a master strategy. It's reacting to the input. So we were the input, so we're constantly pushing it to move faster. In chaos, this is sort of wicked problem space where cause and effect, you'll never really be able to describe exactly what had happened. So that requires a different type of just sort of autocratic leadership to restabilize and get it back up, at least into the complex space. Next slide, please. And so what we found ourselves doing, again, this is all in hindsight, the conversation at the time was much more muddled, obviously, is taking these highly effective small teams, pushing them across that boundary into the unpredictable space where they're at their best. They can go and engage with targets as they come up, find new information, and bring it back into the system. That seemed to appease both sides because the system is doing what it does well. The teams are going out into the space where they're very comfortable. The problem was that we stepped back and really looked at the battlefield. The situation around was getting worse and worse at an exponential rate. That was where, fortunately for us, Dan McChrystal came in with some other key leadership and said, okay, we're willing to have this higher level conversation and fundamentally question how we're designed as an organization. Next slide, please. So, next slide. You ended this sort of this binary discussion. At least we were there for a while, and you see this in all sorts of sectors now outside of the military as well. Next slide, please. The question being, is it an either-or choice? Do we have to remain structured as a big traditional bureaucracy and scale that and use all the traditional powers to bring those to bear? Or do we have to move to this network sort of model, which seems fancy and fast, but it's chaotic, and how do you lead that? How do you, in the industry, how do you incentivize inside of that model? How do you train and develop your people, et cetera? So there's a lot of concern in other sectors as well of just completely going to that red line model. Next slide, please. What we actually became, and we did not articulate it like this at the time, is this sort of hybrid structure. So that there's a misnomer that the task force became, very flat, became a network to defeat a network. All those are sort of half-truths in my opinion. The white line bureaucracy did not go away. I never once felt like I was Stan McChrystal's new drinking buddy. It was not a network of peers that all just shared information. We had a traditional rank structure, a traditional leadership model, which I think was critical. There were all sorts of linear functions that still had to continue to happen inside the military. You weren't going to plan your 5-year budget or your training cycle or your recruiting through a distributed network. Those are linear functions that require linear thinking somewhere in the Pentagon or back home around the world. But on a nightly cadence, those red line networks were layered in so that we could move as quickly as the networks we were facing. So I like to say, in hindsight, we were led through the white lines, but we fought through the red lines. And the way that those two were coupled together was through a very deliberate communication structure where McChrystal and others around the world started pulling more and more folks into a much faster, much more inclusive and transparent and higher cadence communication model that synchronized the entire global task force on a daily basis so that everyone had heightened levels of awareness about what mattered, what the current strategic thinking was, so you could then push down and decentralize into the ranks, into those red line networks, and they could move extremely fast during periods of decentralization. Next slide. So advancing now several years, once you end up with this sort of model, you position the entire organization on the left side of the Kennevan model. Next slide, please. And you can take your small teams. They're still in this sort of fight, they're still your most effective force. And now you're pushing them out on your terms. Most of the fighting, I would argue, is taking place in that complex space, which is fundamentally unpredictable, but you've given them the authority and the speed to move as fast as the networks. But when they're predictable, complicated level problems or even simple level structures, you can always live in that space very easily. To say, if it's a simple problem, give it a simple solution. We didn't submit travel claims through some distributed network crazy model. That's just a simple thing you do every time you get back from a trip. There's no reason to over-complexify simple issues that every organization faces. And similarly, I think more important, that the task force toggled between unpredictable, this complex space, and pure chaos really effectively, simply by communicating more broadly at a higher cadence. And so if there's some radically different sort of mission that was going to go around the world, all those red line networks already existed. You just would layer more and more of them into the communication cycle for a briefer period, maybe a day, maybe 2 days, until that situation resettled itself, and then you'd go back towards business as normal, which is in that hybrid structure. So as a funny aside, one of the industry senior leaders we've worked with the last few years, once he and his team got their heads around this model, one of them commented, this is, going back 2 years, we would get a root canal every 12 to 18 months. Now I just have a little bit of a toothache every single day. So it's sort of what it felt like. It's not great marketing, so please don't repeat that. Next slide, please. And so the final piece to address here is that there's obviously a shift in leadership behaviors that have to take place in this space. An important caveat, I was never at the strategic level as a senior leader. I got out as a commander when I left the service, but spent that a year as McChrystal's aide, his final year commanding the task force, so I was able to observe sort of the strategic level changes. Next slide, please. And so one thing that I saw then, a lot of us felt, was this transition from what we now refer to as the transition away from the chess master model of senior leadership, very traditional models of, learn to be the one senior leader that can control the whole battlefield. Next slide, please. Into what we refer to in Team of Teams as leading like a gardener. Not a term I used in the SEAL teams, but true nonetheless. The idea there being, in today's environment, it's moving so fast with such levels of complexity, the best leaders are much more focused on setting an environment, setting the conditions in which, if you get the right things in the soil, just stand back and let them do what they do best. Protect them from the surrounding environment that they can't control for on their own. Only senior leadership can come in and ensure the right relationships are in place, ensure the right authorities are in place, et cetera, and allow those folks closest to the ground to connect as those red line networks and execute at speeds that you couldn't possibly centrally control in today's environment. Next slide. So it's very quick, but I appreciate it, and I will turn it over to Claire.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and congratulations to all of you on an important book. I'll speak from the perspective of research and field practice. I've spent most of the last couple of decades in the field trying to implement the theories about building partner capacity through an approach that's akin to a form of FID, foreign internal defense, that we call foreign internal governance. But how does one approach the improving of governance from the inside out? Coming back to the big picture, it's clear that the state, the organization we depend on as the basis of international order, is under increased pressure and in places in crisis, and this crisis is both at the root cause of many problems that we're seeing, but also its increasing weakness is caused by those very same pressures. The crisis of the state is not confined to one set of countries. One might say all countries are confronting challenges to varying degrees of governance, and not least because of the changes in the environment we've been discussing over the last couple of hours, and including expectations of citizens, new technologies, fiscal pressures, and the changing dynamics of social networks. I'd like to recognize that it seems a particular challenge in parts of the Western Hemisphere and particular features that most of this audience will know extremely well: the gangs, the cartels, the corruption, crime, and poor governance, which sets in motion a vicious cycle. As legitimacy and trust erode, a vicious cycle emerges of less trust, of people less willing to pay their taxes. They turn elsewhere for public goods, further diminishing the capability and space for the state. My colleagues and I at the Institute of State Effectiveness have been undertaking an inquiry over the last months, what we call the State of the State, and going around the world just asking leaders what are they confronting. And the answer that that comes at the top of the threats and challenges that they're facing is they call it the hollowing out of the state. As previous speakers have well documented, the intertwining of legitimate and illegitimate activity within the government and its agencies. So, moving on to the solutions part of the event today, the need for the state is clear, and I think we all know there's no shortcut to the establishment of legitimate state authority. And the state building agenda, there's a clear need for it, or building partner capacity. But what does this mean in today's environment? As speakers remind us that it's not the strong state that we need to create. It's about the legitimacy and authority. We can't recreate the old hierarchies of the past, in part because of changing citizen expectations globally. So a very important task ahead is to update the notion of the state so that it's relevant of the real needs of real people. And central to this is a social contract or compact between the government and their governments. This will vary from country to country, but the core functions will look remarkably similar. In the book that I put out nearly a decade ago with Dr. Ashraf Ghani, we set out what those core functions might look like. We're in the process of a rewrite. We think it'll change, and it's changing today. But the function that we'd add today that wasn't as apparent a decade ago is the central importance of communications with publics in real time, as Chris Fussell has just elaborated on. In each context, the challenge is to find the cross-section of what citizens need and what the state can actually provide today, but also provide over time in the future. And timeframes really matter. I'll come back to this. Next point, while establishing the state matters, the state and maybe the ultimate goal of providing stability, the state is not the only entry point. We hear a lot about multi-stakeholder partnerships, and this can sound glib, but it really, really matters. Entry points include the economy, and acknowledging the question from the earlier panel, the role of legitimate business and economy fundamentally important. I had the opportunity to interview special representatives of the Secretary General of the United Nations who've been involved in brokering peace deals and trying to supervise and implement them over the last couple of decades, and all of them said in retrospect their biggest regret, and one of the things that they would have changed if they'd done it again, and one of the main reasons they thought that instability reemerged and in many cases the peace agreement collapsed, was that they forgot about the economy, or they thought it could wait till later. They were focused on the political and security track and thought that once security had been established, then you could turn to the economy. They said what they realized is that the economy isn't something you wait for. If you don't have a legitimate economy, you have a criminal and illicit economy. And what's going to happen? Young men won't have jobs, certainly not legitimate jobs. You won't be able to pay for the things that you promise. And then the dynamics of the criminal economy will turn the politics back. So one of the key things. So how does one increase and partner with legitimate business, but increase the space for legitimate economy? The other entry point, citizen networks, the public and citizens, social movements, political parties as transmission belts for policies, and we all need to, I believe, pay much more attention in this field to culture, identity, ideology, and the political agendas that are being developed. Ronfeld talks about the hierarchy and the network in the tribe. In some cases, tribes will be relevant, but in other cases, the kind of tribes, the community, and the family that can be harnessed to the same objectives. It's clear that the agenda of state building or building partner capacity or COIN has been discredited in understanding over the last years, in part because of the efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think, very tragically, what's happening in Iraq and particularly Syria today, that it's now becoming clear that the cost of disengagement can become much higher than the costs of engagement. But there's still a need to try and reset the agenda, and this book goes a long way to do this. But I think we also, as a community, need to put serious effort now into upgrading how. And it's clear to me that there are many, many ways that we have the knowledge and we have the resources. Well, there may be fiscal pressure in public budgets around the world, although I think in many cases that's more of a perceived than a real cuts. There is no shortage of capital in the world. And one only has to spend a little bit of time up in a forum like Davos or in Wall Street to know that the investors on the other side of this coin are all complaining that they've got trillions of dollars in assets that they've got nowhere to put. Now, are these going to flow to unstable countries tomorrow? No, and perhaps nor should they until the legitimate pathways are created. But there are no shortage of resources if the right pathways can be found. So now turning to the how. Many of these threats and challenges may seem insurmountable, but I think it's also very important to keep in mind the opportunity. We have that knowledge and resource in place. Very important case studies are the ones where countries have moved in the right direction over the last decade. And despite the challenges in the finalization of the peace deal in Colombia, I think Colombia still stands as an extremely important example where the state as a legitimate and trusted organization at the center, but also critically at the city level and the local level, moved strides in the right direction over a 10 to 20-year period. Other examples in the Americas, very inspiring and very important, including, if one takes a longer perspective, Peru, Chile, Panama. But there are also examples in many other parts of the world. So important part of a research agenda going forward is how have leaders, managers, and their external partners been able to work together on a long-term process of tackling instability, criminality, corruption, and state weakness. So now turning finally to the how-to, and my co-author on this chapter and I have set out some rules of thumb or a description of what might lie in this toolbox, while acknowledging that a lot more needs to be done to refine it. First is to open up the black box of government and really increase our ability to be able to read when is a government as a whole, but the different agencies of government, when are they being used for their intended purposes, but when have they become intertwined with the criminal networks and their objectives subverted? The second is to break down our understanding of what are the core systems and core functions of the government that need to be provided. I think and with all credit to security institutions, collectively we've become quite good at defense institution building of armies and ministries of defense. A much, much harder institution to build is police forces and law enforcement. And so building partner capacity in the police dimension is clearly an area where there are some great examples, but much more thinking and improvement in methods are needed. And then how do these link to the other institutions of the state in the country in question? What about the banking regulators? What about the ministries of finance? What about the education systems? And I think there's an important agenda to look at how do each of these institutions need to be built? How are core systems established in each of these individually, but how do they work across as an integrated system? So in short, I believe there are methods, there are case examples, but there's a lot of work in the years ahead to bring together this body of knowledge and turn it into practice. Just concluding on the importance of time frames. As one looks back at the examples of countries that have tackled criminality and crime successfully, this doesn't happen in the 1 to 3 year cycles of our own planning frames. This happens over periods of 10 to 20 years, often 20 to 30 years. The authors of the World Development Report of the World Bank a few years back on conflict and security thought that the answer probably lay into 30 to 50 year time frames. But it's clear that we need to begin to take these time frames as a basis for planning, not to say that the 1 to 3 and the 5 to 10 years, the short term and the medium terms, aren't important as well. And within that, the adaptability and agility to keep adapting as the threats and challenges evolve. Thank you.
And finally, Selena, to you.
Well, you heard from Chris talking about team of teams, whether it's within the military or more importantly in the private sector, how you'd apply that. And we also heard from Claire about the state and the role of the state and how we can enhance the role of the state. I want to take it to the next level and looking at public-private partnerships, because we know that states no longer have a monopoly on the solution sets when we take a look at such complex threats. Next slide. So we live in the age of globalization. So as I see everyone checking their iPhones or their BlackBerries, you decide what you choose, or the Android, or the Samsung. Hopefully none of them are on that are going to be setting fire to the NDU Lincoln Hall Auditorium. We've seen, and I think we are the generation that has deeply benefited from the drivers of globalization. The prosperity, the technological advances, amazing advances in health and quality of life. But we've also seen that these global drivers have also been accompanied by those who are exploiting them that are from what I call the dark side of globalization, whether they be insurgents or criminals or terrorists. Next slide. And what we've seen over the past 30 years is actually a multiplication of the stakeholders who are involved in these types of what we call global issues. We used to have just worry about nation states in the Westphalian system that Phil Williams alluded to, and the international organizations that were born in a post-World War II actual environment. But now we see whether they're superpowered individuals, for example, bin Laden, some people would say Julian Assange, and WikiLeaks, or people who have actually become real entrepreneurs to change how we look at, more importantly, things like space exploration. We've seen that these other non-state actors are playing a much more aggressive and, more importantly, an intrusive role in issues, particularly in the sphere of security and defense. And what we see is that they're actually threatening the 4 basic missions of any government across the world, which are to provide security, promote prosperity, really ensure a rule of law, and more importantly, governance, that the actual government respects and reflects the will of the people. What we see in the different crises, next slide, we're living in one of the most unstable times. And this is just a little map, whether we talk about the conflict in the Middle East, and more importantly, the refugee crisis that's now affecting Europe, migration crisis even here in our Western Hemisphere, as well as all these illicit activities of the different types of trade that are taking place that have been alluded to by a lot of our previous speakers, whether it's drugs, weapons, sadly people, contraband, wildlife. We've seen how this dark side of globalization has been really exploited by our adversaries, whether they be in the form of a nation state or, more importantly, in these illicit networks that we talk about. And underneath this all, we've actually seen that all of these issues are much more transversal and transregional, especially in the space of cyber and the new domain that we have to take a look at. And more importantly, how it affects us at a personal level, and then more importantly, at a institutional level, thinking about this, the divide between security versus privacy, then more importantly, how everything now that we put on the internet is privy to others' eyes, and perhaps not the eyes that you wanted to have them see the contents of those emails. The next slide. What we're seeing now is really this convergence of terror crime networks, which was really delved into 3 years ago when we published the first book on Convergence. And sadly, history has proven that this collaboration or hybridization between terror and criminal networks, whether we talk about what happens in Afghanistan, the rise of ISIL in Iraq and Syria and beyond, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. People keep forgetting they're still out there, Al-Qaeda. Or groups such as the FARC in Colombia, Shining Path in Peru, or Hezbollah and its global networks. They all have an agenda that's wrought with fear, violence, and more importantly, a very nefarious agenda that is in contrary to the sovereignty and more importantly, the prosperity and security that we want to promise to our citizens. And this is this concept of this convergence that we delved into 3 years ago when we published the first book. Next slide. So what we see is really this idea of how do we think about countering this convergence of illicit networks, particularly as these illicit networks really take advantage of the velocity, magnitude, and sadly the wealth that this dark side of globalization affords them. So we've actually been trying to attack this at a governmental level, at the multilateral, regional, and then at the national level. Next slide. What we see is at the level of the United Nations, there are actual conventions countering terrorism, corruption, and the Palermo Convention looking at transnational organized crime that have been with us for about 15 years, and institutions within the United Nations that try to build partner capacity, whether it be through the UN Counterterrorism Committee or through the UN ODC that's based in Vienna. But sometimes that's just not enough in terms of trying to counter these very, very powerful and lethal networks that are really now pernicious throughout different regions in the world. Next slide. We've tried to also delve deeper at the multilateral and more importantly the regional level, whether it's through the OAS and the Counterterrorism Committee in SICTE or their counter-drug operations and efforts in CICAD, or through NATO or the African Union. We've seen these efforts at the governmental level try to be replicated in terms of sharing best practices and collaborating and information and intelligence sharing. But a lot of times, a lot of our institutions are very slow. The bureaucracy is quite slow to keep up with the pace of these very adaptive and flexible networks that we're trying to counter. Next slide. And at the national level, we've been very busy. And I think it was fantastic that Dasdi Hollis was able to share with us the forthcoming strategy to look at how to counter these networks. We've actually had a national security strategy that the new president will outline in the coming months. And underneath them, we have discrete countering transnational threat strategies. And interestingly, they've always been responsive or reactive, whether it was after 9/11, the design of the counterterrorism strategy. More recently, under the Obama administration, we have a cybersecurity and a countering transnational organized crime strategy, taking a look at how we can best organize ourselves, prioritize, and more importantly, allocate the resources to counter a specific transnational threat. Next slide. What we see is what I saw in terms of examining how governments were trying to react and respond to these transnational threats. We were quite limited because in the world of globalization, a lot of these activities take place for the good and the bad, particularly not in the public sector. So what I tried to do is take a look and research this idea of partnering with the private sector and the civic sector, in which I include academia, religious organizations, NGOs, to widen the aperture, and then more importantly, take a look at how we can really try to counter these different aspects. And I chose today to take a look at how we're partnering with the different sectors, looking at the counter ISIL fight, whether it's through countering violent extremism, going after their money, taking a look at cyberspace and how they're messaging and recruiting, and then more importantly, how we're better actually making ourselves resilient to a potential terrorist attack. So let's go through this. Next slide. And take a look at how this has been done. So I've chosen 4 specific of the 9 lines of efforts delineated in President Obama's counter-ISIL strategy, which is about 2 years old, taking a look at looking at the financing, its true nature, which is this concept of countering violent extremism, the flow of foreign fighters, not just there, but now we're worried about the returnees, and then more importantly, protecting the homeland, which is the basic mission of our government and our security forces. Next slide. So we've seen, we now look at ISIL as a criminalized state, an example of convergence. Its rise was not through a coup. Its rise was actually through criminal acts of taking territory, robbing banks, subjecting people to occupation, and a lot of their activities are, in fact, criminal. And they've actually built their own state across two nation states of Syria and Iraq. Next slide. And what we've seen is their capacity to use social media and the internet to recruit unprecedented numbers. You can build the slide. To reach almost 40,000 recruits that have come from over 100 countries. And what we've seen is how and why have they been able to be so resilient? And this is an area that I focus on a lot on. Next slide. They've actually been able to diversify their sources of income. And as Ms. Hollis alluded to, we've been very deliberate in terms of trying to deny them this type of income. Most of their income is now from extortion, which is deemed taxes, and then also from oil smuggling, actual physical robberies of banks, kidnapping, and the sale of antiquities. This is why they've become a state that's been much harder to defeat than any of us had anticipated when we were looking at this problem a couple of years ago. Next slide. And unfortunately, when we thought it was an away game and we could contain and neutralize, the initial mission was to degrade and destroy ISIL, and that was articulated 2 years ago in 2014. We've actually seen the group and more importantly its movement metastasize, and we now have to distinguish between what we consider directed attacks. Those are people who've actually gone and fought with ISIL, who are now being sent, for example. The examples would be Brussels and the November 13th attacks in Paris. Operatives who are sent back as cells to conduct terrorist attacks, versus inspired attacks, which we've actually witnessed here in the United States on our soil. Those who have espoused and, more importantly, felt the need to act on that, and, more importantly, conspire to commit violence against innocents, which is the definition of terrorism, but particularly in the name of ISIL. And we've seen this now metastasize well beyond just the immediate Middle East and North Africa to other parts of the world. Next slide. What we did was try to organize ourselves in the campaign against ISIL in three basic areas or spheres of focus. The one that you're seeing play out right now in the attempt to recapture Mosul is the physical or the military realm. The other piece that we've been looking at is the financial realm, how to deny them the financial wherewithal to continue their occupation and, more importantly, their war and their other operations abroad. And the third one is this idea of countering violent extremism, the ideology. They're integrally, they're each important, but even more so, a very important comprehensive approach is what we've actually been trying to take and, more importantly, effect change. Next slide. So what you're seeing now on CNN is actually a footage of what are the kinetic, or more importantly, the military operations in the offensive, assisting the Iraqis try to retake Mosul in what is called Operation Inherent Resolve. We've been conducting this for over 2 years. It's run out of Central Command, but we have over 64 countries that are members of the coalition at a cost of $11.6 million a day. Just to give you a kind of scale, even though it's not in the news every day. Next slide. What we've seen is that they're doing a lot more to try to include actual financial targets. The idea is to suffocate and, more importantly, deny and deprive the Islamic State of the income-generating pieces. Next slide. And what we've seen is physically attacking and, more importantly, destroying the supply chain and the oil infrastructure, which is what you can see on your left, or the actual stashes of cash is what we call them, the warehouses where a lot of the money has been basically centralized in order to pay for the expenses of maintaining their state and, more importantly, paying the foreign fighters. Next slide. And what we've seen, too, is that ISIL has tried to operate beyond its borders, and more importantly, in order to recruit, we're actually working very closely now and partnering with the private sector, particularly looking at these new ways that we've moved money, whether it's through mobile money or, more importantly, through the virtual world. Perhaps you've heard of the currency called Bitcoin, and how a lot of the foreign fighters are either being paid this way, or more importantly, we fear that the deep dark web is not being used just for recruitment, but actually for physically financing a lot of these would-be operatives around the world. It's an important piece because a lot of those who are developing the financial technology and the new ways and methods of payment are the ones who best understand their vulnerabilities, or more importantly, how these groups and these individuals can abuse that system in order to realize their terrorist operations. Next slide. So we've done the same thing in terms of partnering with the civic sector. In February of last year, President Obama hosted a Countering Violent Extremism Summit with a very large international display of members of different sectors of society to try to better understand what is it about the messaging from ISIL that is so attractive that would lead a young person to leave the creature comforts of their home in order to go to the desert and fight with strangers. And it was a very important moment to also delineate what the best way is to take a look at how we do it actually with gang members, youth at risk who could be vulnerable to this type of interpretation of Islam, and how best to work between governments and communities to basically create safe spaces, and more importantly, a way to also reintegrate those who have perhaps joined and then have now decided it's not exactly the paradise that was promised, and how to reincorporate them and de-radicalize them when they return in terms of that returnee flow. Next slide. What we're seeing then now is also the government is now partnering with a lot of social media companies. You'll see, for those of you who use Facebook or Twitter, there are a lot of Privacy Act. They are actually teams that monitor to take a look at any type of extremist posts that are included there, and then more importantly, how to warn them and how to actually shut down Twitter accounts, which is a much more aggressive position that we're taking now, partnering with the private sector and a lot of these companies that are the social platforms that groups like ISIL take advantage of. Next slide. What we're very worried about is actually this flow that has gone to fight with ISIL, but even more so those who are coming back. And this is the way we take a look at how a young person, or more importantly, someone who's susceptible for this, would decide to make that journey to join a group like ISIL, and then more importantly, get the training and the indoctrination while they're, for example, in Syria. And then when they come back, what would be the conditions in which they would think about acting alone or in a group in order to conduct something as horrific as the November 13th Paris attacks. So this is an area where we're trying to raise awareness about types of behavior. And next slide, we're seeing how we can actually raise awareness of people who are different communities. So I wanted to highlight this case, which is quite fresh. For those who remember, it was just on September 17th in New Jersey and New York. Ahmad Khan is the suspect for a failed bombing of Marine Corps run in New Jersey on the morning of, and then the 23rd Street pressure cooker bomb, which injured several, but thankfully no one was killed on that day. It was really the role of average citizens who saw something and said something in the case of New York. For those who don't know, the woman who on the 4 blocks away from where the 23rd Street bomb actually exploded, there was a pressure cooker, a little pot, for those who are trying to do the translation, on the street. So this woman actually saw it on her way up to her apartment, didn't think anything of it, but then she turned on the news, and then she saw this was taking place. She thought twice, went back downstairs, took a picture with her iPhone of the pressure cooker, and then she called. She thought she was being stupid, calling 911. Then she meets the police downstairs who are with a dog, who then tell her to run for her life. But it's very interesting that she herself talks about how she had doubts. And then the next day is the first time that on your alert system, you probably all have the warning of alert for either usually extreme weather for tornadoes or like an Amber Alert that a child is missing. In New York, they activated that Amber Alert system to notify all the iPhones in the area with the picture of the be on the lookout for this suspect. And then he was actually found by a bar owner in New Jersey he was sleeping in the stoop of the back of entrance of his bar. He took a look at him, and then he called. And they captured him within 2 hours of this mass communication. There was a lot of criticism in the city of New York that it overhyped, and it was too much, and it was an abuse. And there's another thing is that if you actually had less than an iPhone 5, that you actually didn't see the picture, you could see the warning, but it didn't really help because the technology wasn't there to actually load the photo. So it's a very interesting way that now, with partnering with the different community groups and how you're using technology to help you be on the lookout for this person. Next slide. So that's actually why we really want to reiterate this concept of if you see something, say something. Because you are the one who knows your community, your neighborhood, your sector, your industry better than anyone else. And there have to be better ways to communicate in a safe space without retribution if you see something and you say something. And what we're doing now, particularly in the fight against ISIL, is whether it's with the private sector. I was just at a banking conference a couple weeks ago trying to raise awareness, because a lot of the behavior you see, for example, in the case of San Bernardino as well as Orlando, the shooters were starting to prepare to basically do a suicide attack. They were starting to transfer their money to relatives. They were starting to transfer the deed to their actual house for a value of $10 to a relative. And these are young men. So these are the question of how do you raise awareness among the average citizenry who know their community better, but also how do you make it easier for them to reach out to government. And this is an area that we're really trying to build out in terms of raising awareness. So just to finish up, next slide, is taking a look at, since we now know that governments, we are all facing resource constraints irrespective of where we live in the world. We actually do have tremendous assets in the private sector and the civic sector. But the better thing that we have to do is figure out how to best communicate our needs from the government side, how to accept the offers from, particularly in the cyber security space. How do we keep up with the technology and the communications and the information, this whole big data revolution that's taking place? And how do we establish mechanisms to better communicate across? Because I think Claire mentioned it, there are tremendous assets that are out there that are not necessarily owned by the government. So how do we build a better way at looking at national security threats well beyond just the government sector? So we're looking at this as a cross-sector piece. So I call it C3 through P3, because we work at DOD, and you have to have all kinds of little acronyms and little gizmos. So communicate, cooperate, and collaborate through the public-private sector partnerships. Thank you.
Okay, let's go directly to the audience for some questions. Yes, sir. Right over here. Microphone, please. When you get the microphone, if you'll please give us your name and where you're from, and a quick question.
Que Turquía es un aliado importante de los Estados Unidos. ¿Cómo compatibiliza ese concepto teniendo en consideración que, como todos sabemos, Turquía apoya veladamente a ISIS, ya que ISIS combate a los kurdos y al movimiento terrorista PKK? Y considerando lo que dice el profesor Chris, de este ambiente complejo, ¿cómo se analiza bajo la perspectiva americana esta situación?
I wasn't going to. I was just going to let it go one at a time.
So in the case of Turkey, it's quite complicated. So they are a partner of NATO, a NATO partner, but more importantly, we have to understand the geostrategic location of Turkey as well as the internal struggles that it has against its own nominated. Basically, it's decried the PKK as a terrorist group against the interests of Turkey. Turkey is actually itself, and it's not as advertised in the Western press, suffered many attacks and casualties from ISIS itself. And they've done a tremendous job trying to close the actual border between Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. What we see, though, that whole area is so complicated because of what we see as ethnic and religious, and more importantly, long historical rivalries between different groups. It's not a place where your enemy's enemy is your friend, as opposed to what some people think of in other parts of the world. It's just everyone's an enemy. It's very complicated to see. What we've seen now with Turkey, too, because they've had their own struggle of an attempted coup, they're trying to solidify, and they've been a very good partner with us in terms of trying to fight and bring ISIL to its knees. When you'll see the latest reports on the offensive with Mosul, Turkey is one of the key allies that is actually helping the Iraqis in order to fight ISIS in the latest campaign that just started 48 hours ago. But it's quite difficult. And more importantly, we can't choose. Governments can't necessarily choose who their partners and allies are. But you have to work within what are your national interests that hopefully align with the national interests of your partner allies to meet and, more importantly, comply and realize the mission, which I think everyone has seen the atrocities and the barbarity of this group ISIS. And it's great to see finally this offensive that's been long awaited against Mosul, which is the second largest city, for those who don't know, in Iraq, and is a very critical center of power for ISIS, even though its actual capital is in Syria, in a city called Raqqa. It's a very good question.
Okay, next question. Sure.
Buenas tardes, Germán Sajid, Colombia. De acuerdo a la presentación de la profesora Ralullo, donde las FARC son evidentemente un grupo terrorista, ¿cuál es el interés del gobierno de Estados Unidos en apoyar los diálogos de paz con las FARC?
So in the case of the United States, the FARC continues to be what's called a foreign terrorist organization. And actually our assistance to the Colombian government, besides the counter-narcotics piece of Plan Colombia, was also a counterterrorism piece. So at the beginning of the Bush administration, people don't realize that initially the FARC was not in the package of counterterrorism. It was actually originally drafted as countering Al-Qaeda and its allies, Hezbollah and Hamas. But as you remember, there were 3 American contractors who were held hostage, which then was an act of terrorism against American citizens that then allowed us to expand our assistance to Colombia in the form of Plan Colombia. So now there's a new problem, right? So the European Union has actually already delisted the FARC as a terrorist group because the government of Colombia has delisted them, and now it's a criminal organization as opposed to a terrorist organization. Here in the United States, it will take several legislative acts in order to delist the FARC. But I think irrespective of what we call and categorize different groups, the objective of our Convergence book was to actually try to illuminate that irrespective if a group calls itself a criminal group or a cartel or a mafia, we, I think, are in agreement that these groups present a threat to the security and prosperity of all of our peoples, and we have to figure out how best to marshal our resources in order to counter them. But it's a big question of when the lawyers now, what will happen next?
Another question? Mark Wilkins, please.
From the Perry Center. For either Chris or Claire, a little bit of governance. Many of our partner nations in this hemisphere preside over defense and security sectors, which are sort of late 20th century plotting, maybe in another word. But most of the leaders are coming to grips with what you described, and they know they have to build organizations that operate at the same speed and complexity of these networks, evolving networks. Based upon your research and our own experience, what advice would you give these leaders who are sort of rapidly trying to jerk their organizations into that complex and chaos side of the equation so they can rapidly adapt and run their own operations, counter-network?
I'll start on that, of your Claire's thoughts as well. I always think the best place to start is an honest conversation with senior leadership around 2 things. First, and this can get very interesting quickly, is what is the pace of the external problem? What are you really trying to solve for? Because we're all hardwired to look internally at, well, what else can we fix about our current system? Just put that on the table to the side and start talking about the external environment. We didn't do that formally, but it took us a while to realize, wow, every day when we wake up, Al-Qaeda is a different thing. It has shaped itself based on our actions the previous night. And we don't adapt anywhere near that quickly. We can't even get orders down to the front lines in less than 2 days or so. So that totally changed the conversation. So if they're willing to start with that and have an honest dialogue about what is actually happening externally, then you can take it to the next level and say, do you feel like you have the leadership team in place to transition the organization through some sort of shift, which, on a good day is an 18-month to 2-year cycle. That's just, organizational change takes time. You can get better every single day, but you're not going to get in shape the first time you go to the gym. So you have to have a leadership team that's willing to commit to a process. And if it's not necessarily full of bad people, it's just not the right time in the organization, then you can, if you start to go down a road like this, I believe you can create as many problems as you solve for. Because if you get halfway towards transitioning into this sort of communication structure, you'll just really confuse people throughout. So they have to be dedicated to a significant multi-month change process.
Claire, did you have anything to add to that?
I very much agree. In the 18 cases we looked at, the bad news is, of course, that there are no 7 steps, but there were some common attributes, and the first was building that team. History will often talk about one leader, but what we found is there was a team of people. So building that team, and what we found was, this is something we struggled for a long time, they themselves had a zero tolerance attitude to corruption. Now, it's not that they could root out corruption overnight. They then had a long-term goal of rooting it out over time. And they were clear amongst this leadership team of where they wanted to get to. There wasn't exactly a blueprint, but there were a set of phases towards that. And this is where I think I'd sort of ask questions of the NATO doctrine. It wasn't so much a comprehensive approach, but it was a sequenced, integrated approach. Where the leadership team would say they really only tackle 2 or 3 big problems every 2 or 3 years. But over a 10 to 15-year period, they got to all of them in turn.
I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and follow that question up with a very quick one, again, for Claire and Chris, which is that, as Doug Farah said, they're playing basketball and we're playing football, and we're kind of asymmetrically matched against them. But things are the way they are for a reason, because somebody is benefiting from the way things are. So when we want to reform or when we want to create a team of teams, I'm sure that you've both encountered resistance. And what's the way to overcome the institutional resistance to change?
It's interesting as a military audience. For the most part, there's a lot of perception in all other sectors that, well, in the military you just order people to do stuff and they do it, which of course anybody in uniform knows that doesn't really work that way. Depending on the tribe you're in inside the military, there's variations of how wrong that is. But I don't think I ever gave a direct order in my life in the SEAL teams. It just doesn't work like that. But to get the momentum going, I think, aside from what we previously discussed around an honest discussion among senior leadership and a commitment, really focus on 2 areas. One being sort of the process work that has to change. How do you communicate? How do you pass information across traditional firewalls? How do you decentralize down to the front line, whatever space you happen to be in, to make independent decisions? That's all tied into some sort of process that in most organizations now you can map to the org chart that's on the wall. It goes from A to B, up and down, that sort of thing. So people have to see a visible sort of visceral shift in how that's occurring. What McChrystal did has a very tangible example in that he created a 24/7 sort of communication cycle. So we would start every day with a global video teleconference of thousands of people. So that was very much in your face, that every 7 days a week you're going to check in and you're going to understand what's going on globally. Most organizations don't want to and shouldn't commit to that aggressive of a model, but something that shows them that we are changing the way that we communicate, and you're going to be invited to be part of it. sends a distinct message, and it starts to lock in a mental state inside the organization that we are shifting. So we can't back down from this once people set their expectations at that level. That has to be then coupled with a different type of leadership behavior. It's talked about a little bit earlier, but if you're getting tens, then hundreds, then potentially thousands of people into a more transparent dialogue, and it's becoming routinized inside of the system, and they're starting to make decisions based on what they're hearing in that sort of structure. There's lots of ways you can approach that. Then the conversations that they're having there and that they're willing to have also have to shift. So you're asking basically, in the military context, very frontline people to come in and speak with very senior leadership on a really aggressive cycle. And so if you don't create a model where that frontline individual, intelligence analyst, troop, whatever the case may be, can give direct and honest feedback about what they're seeing, knowing that it might run counter to the thinking of the senior leadership at that moment, then you're just creating a transactional relationship. And you can just do that by emailing reports, right? If you really want a dialogue, then the senior leadership has to take the first step, which says, okay, tell me what you're seeing on the ground. How is that different than what we talked about yesterday or last week? And it's not always perfect, but we got to the point where that could be a very honest conversation, and you would see the reaction of senior leadership, see them chew on raw data. That was what was most impactful for the organization. It wasn't what Claire was reporting that she was seeing on the ground. That might be interesting. I was much more interested in how the 3- and 4-star level was reacting to that, and the way that they would digest it, and the words that would then come out of their mouths are along the lines of, oh, that's interesting, we weren't aware of that. That makes me think X. That makes me think we should be doing something like this. Would you agree with that? Would you disagree? What do we need to accomplish that? What resources should we be thinking about? This is just, at this point, that's just an open dialogue. They're honestly digesting and thinking out loud in front of the organization. So that once the organization sees that process coupled with a significantly different approach to leadership, then you're on, I believe, sort of an unchangeable curve, because it's now inside the DNA of the organization.
Chris, Claire, any thoughts on that?
First, to distinguish, if you have a reformist leadership, it's going to be a whole lot easier. But many of the places we're talking about, you don't. And I think the big questions there, what do you do when you don't have a leadership that's devoted to reform? Second, then, much of what we're talking about is about the intelligent design of incentive systems. And a lot can be done to incentivize change and create a culture of performance internal to a government. And we know that actually it's not the pecuniary rewards, but it's medals and certificates. It's rewarding the good behavior. But a lot also can be done with external incentives. And that's where, and was well represented on Celine's slide, the IMF and US Treasury and the rewards and sanctions system in external partners becomes so important to changing those incentive systems, whether applied to the state as a whole or individual departments or right down to the individual. And I'll say the third and probably one of the best tools in overcoming resistance is back to communications and having the public on your side. And I think that's one of the changes in the external environment we're seeing. The public is out on the streets in countries around the world demanding the very same things we're talking about, countering corruption, wanting governments that serve them. So alliances with the public is another really important terrain.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this is really important. I hope you're all thinking about how you can create change in your own organizations to meet the challenges we're meeting. Listen, there's never enough time for all the questions we need, so I'm going to bring this segment to a close, and we're about to take a 5-minute stand-up so we can rearrange the stage and then hear the crescendo of this event. But before we stop for 5 minutes, can you join me in thanking our speakers for speaking today?
that table as well.
Okay.
I ought to go, but I sure would.
All right.
I love it. Thank you very much. Okay, you get to introduce.
Yep, of course. No, I don't need any of them on.
No, forget it. Briscoe, would you come and move this?
Sir, can I place this right here as admitted
Sure.
remarks?
Yeah, I'll take this away.
Or I can put it right here, actually. You want to do that?
We need a bottle of water.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you please take your seats so we can have the final segment of this program? All right. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to resume. Can you please take your seats? Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Threat networks, whether in the form of transnational organized crime, trans-regional terrorist organizations, or violent extremist networks, are prevalent throughout the Western Hemisphere, and many have global reach far beyond Latin America and the Caribbean. U.S. Southern Command is a joint command comprised of more than 1,200 military and civilian personnel representing the Department of Defense, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and several other federal agencies. It is in support of U.S. national security objectives throughout the Western Hemisphere in cooperation with domestic and international partners in order to foster security, ensure stability, and promote prosperity throughout Central and South America, the Caribbean, and the global community. Admiral Kurt Tidd, whose extensive biography is in your program, is the commander of U.S. Southern Command. Admiral Tidd, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon. Buenos tardes. I am mindful of the fact that my role right now is somewhat the same as that of a body at an Irish wake. No one expects him to say very much, but the reception doesn't start without him. So my comments will be brief. I will be happy to take questions, and then also I look forward to an opportunity for further conversation afterwards. But first of all, thank you so very much for organizing this very important event, and congratulations on publishing this important work. I'd like to thank the Complex Center for Operations, and especially the Perry Center, with whom we have a very close working relationship, for the invitation to be able to speak today. We value our academic partnership with the National Defense University, and we're excited about this publication. It's great to be here, and I look forward to our discussion. Now let me start with a premise. If I were to ask this audience for a show of hands, I suspect most people would say, if I asked you, what are the main security challenges that we face in Latin America and the Caribbean? And I suspect most of you would probably say, drugs. Pretty much every problem in the region, from corruption to homicide rates to undergoverned spaces, has some sort of linkage to the drug trade, right? Think again. If you only talk about drugs, you're only talking about one part of the story. Contrary to what you might think about Latin America, drugs alone are not the principal security challenge, nor are the millions of people who are trafficked and the thousands more who are smuggled into and out of the region. Neither are the myriad illicit commodities that move through our hemisphere as part of a global flow of illegal goods and services. These illegal flows and the violence and the corruption that these flows introduce at home and abroad are just the visible manifestations of amorphous, adaptable, and networked threats. These networks, as a whole and in their parts, are woven into the fabric of our environment. And wherever they exist, in whatever form they take, be it extremist, criminal, or state-sponsored, threat networks pose a challenge to our security and stability and that of our partners, allies, and friends. I would argue that the trans-regional and transnational threat networks are pressing problems that we as a government and an international community don't fully understand, especially as it relates to the world that we live in today. Not the world that we envision or that we strive to achieve, but the complicated and entangled one that we live in today. And in that world, these networks and the growing illegal economies that support them undercut our national interests in multiple nations, multiple continents, and multiple regions. There are as many different networks as there are disparate goals and creative methods for conducting illegal activities. Some networks, like violent extremist ones, are ideologically or politically motivated. They focus on spreading their influence and moving money, weapons, and people. Criminal networks are focused on accumulating wealth and power by satisfying a demand for an illicit service or substance. Some networks smuggle desperate people from all over the world into our country, where they go on to find jobs or refuge from a conflict, while other networks specialize at moving individuals with questionable backgrounds, worrisome intentions, and possible ties to terrorism through the region and into the United States. Some networks have cornered the market on cocaine trafficking, and some dabble in polycrime activities. Others focus on the production side, working with corrupt businessmen in China to smuggle precursor chemicals into Central America and Mexico to make heroin and fentanyl. Many networks prey on the disadvantaged and the disaffected. Many glamorize violence and use it as a tool to intimidate local populations and inspire legions of wannabes. And from Central America's MS-13 gang to Mexican cartels, and especially to groups like ISIL, many networks exploit social media and popular culture via slick, high-quality videos and music that promotes killing, intimidation, and a code of silence. Many more have established local franchises that have spread like viruses through our communities, and in some cases, across communities, countries, and continents. So what does this mean for us and for our partners in Latin America and the Caribbean? Well, for one thing, it means that we require a different way of thinking about these challenges, both regionally, trans-regionally, and globally. Now, I'm not talking about viewing threat networks in Latin America in terms of convergence or a nexus or a hybrid super threat or whatever today's term du jour happens to be. I'm entirely uninterested in that debate. What I am interested in is conditioning us to think differently and to challenge our own assumptions. As an example, plenty of folks dismiss the possibility that violent extremist organizations and criminal networks would actively collaborate, especially in this part of the world. They're likely correct when they say that drug traffickers may be reluctant to risk working with terrorists, especially to move something like a weapon of mass destruction or an operative. Now, the narco-traffickers aren't stupid. They know it would be bad for business. And terrorists are great at OPSEC. No way that they are going to collude with some group outside of their tight circle of trusted extremists. But here's the issue that I have with that assertion. It presumes that criminal networks exercise absolute oversight and control over their smuggling routes. It presumes that they have their own version of TSA, that they conduct thorough background checks and screen everyone and everything that moves along their illicit superhighways that traverse the region. It presumes that just because witting collaboration might not take place, unwitting collaboration could. It presumes that even if paid enough, the reward would never outweigh the risk. What keeps me up at night is thinking about the many illicit pathways that thread throughout the Western Hemisphere, picturing that interlocking system of arteries that can move just about anything, and imagining a scenario that may not be likely, but is not totally impossible. That members of violent extremist organizations are thinking about those illicit pathways too. And the truth is, whether criminal and extremist networks collaborate or keep their distance, in Latin America and everywhere else, threat networks of all stripes inhabit the same illegal orbits. They all benefit from exploiting the same vulnerable populations and the demand for something that people can get nowhere else. They all use key facilitators like lawyers, accountants, and corrupt officials to exploit weaknesses in our financial and security sectors. And they all excel at harnessing the very tools of globalization: free and open trade, technology, and globally integrated financial, communications, and transportation systems. They've made our societies more prosperous, more interconnected, and, sadly, more vulnerable. So thinking differently about threat networks goes beyond challenging long-held assumptions. It also applies to those of us that make up the friendly networks, the U.S. government and our fellowship of partner nations and allies. Collectively, we would all benefit from a better understanding of one another. While we are integrated well in certain areas, we can always do better. Different players have different pieces of the puzzle, but it's not always clear how those pieces all fit together, especially as we try and figure out how the not-so-friendly networks operate and interact. We have glimpses of financial flows, a partial understanding of the centrality of particular routes and nodes, an expanding knowledge base about how threat networks work, at least in theory, and we have a shared recognition that corruption is a huge part of the problem that allows networks to flourish. And we have a nagging sense that we're using 20th century approaches to fight 21st century threats. Broadly speaking, everyone in the friendly network knows what needs to be done. We need to increase regional cooperation, real-time information sharing, and multinational operations. We need to continue building and reinforcing bonds of trust across and between our own military, law enforcement, diplomatic, and intelligence communities, fusing these bonds with bilaterally and multilaterally with our key partners. We need to explore innovative technologies that don't just make us smarter, but make us better. We need to build, expand, and coordinate more effectively among and across agencies, departments, and ministries. At U.S. Southern Command, we're looking to do exactly that. We're also going one step further, and we're seeking to develop a networked view of the environment and a networked view of ourselves. And so at U.S. Southcom, we're lifting our sights from an exclusive focus on a single illicit commodity, drugs, and instead we're asking ourselves, what can we do differently to be better partners to the rest of the interagency? Part of this decision comes from a candid recognition that for years we've been triaging the symptoms of the problem rather than addressing the root problem itself. And in that time, that problem has adapted and grown in complexity, while our efforts to address it have not. What's really for Southcom changing is our goal. Until now, we focused on what we can diminish or degrade. How many metric tons of cocaine can we disrupt? How many coca or marijuana plants can we help our partners eradicate? And while that remains important, it's time we start building something too. What we're driving towards is better integration, better understanding, and better support to law enforcement efforts. Ultimately, we want to help our partners in the U.S. government and across Latin America and the Caribbean to build a network that is stronger, more adaptive, and more interconnected than any threat network can ever hope to be. And the network that is assembled by the National Defense University represented here today is a great place to start. So with that, I'd like to stop, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Admiral, good afternoon. Very interesting remarks. My name is Carlos Alvarez. I'm from the Colombian War College. Colombia was before a source of migration towards the United States and the world. But now we have become a preferred bridge of illegal migration from Africa, Asia, even the Middle East. We don't still regard illegal migration as an emerging threat. But as you said, it can become a real threat, not only for Colombia, but for the region. In that sense, my question is this. What kind of strategy do you think would be necessary to implement in Colombia to raise up the awareness of illegal migration as a threat, as a national threat for the Colombian state?
Of course. I think it's a classic case where you occupy a key piece of geography where it is a funnel, and if people are moving overland from any place in South America up into Central America and North America, they must pass through Colombia. There is no alternative unless they go by sea out across the Caribbean. In the past, migration, the movement of people, was simply that. It was the movement of people, largely driven by interest to seek something different, perhaps seek circumstances or a life that provided economic opportunity that might not have been available where people were leaving from. What's different now is there are other people who seek to use those same pathways. And the concern that I think we share with many of our law enforcement and intelligence partners from across the region is within those networks that have specialized in illegally moving people, that can serve as a mask, that can serve as a conduit for individuals who are intent on perhaps more dangerous activities, who see that as a pathway for entry into North America and perhaps into our country in order to conduct an attack. And so why is it important? We all share a responsibility to ensure that people who are intent on illegal activities that can harm the security of the entire region, that we must contribute, we must work together, we must share information more effectively. We have mechanisms in place to be able to have better understanding of who actually is moving within those pathways. As people move through and across borders, as they move through transit zones, as they check through immigration facilities at various countries all along the way, there is an opportunity to understand exactly who they are, where they are coming from, and what purpose they have in traveling. That flies in the face of what these illegal networks are intent on doing, which is to move people without law enforcement having any knowledge or awareness of it. But this is one where I think we have a shared responsibility, as opposed to perhaps just moving the problem along so that it doesn't stop, in my particular neighborhood. I think we all have a shared responsibility to safeguard the security of our entire region. That's a team sport. That's not one that any of us can afford to try to accomplish on our own. Better not go too far from my trusty translator. Other questions?
Hi, good afternoon. Lia Espinosa from Peru. I have a question. Is how to adapt and redesign in Latin America the strategies to tackle the new criminal networks, taking into account these social networks that are new, like the deep web, that could be a new sphere that permit interaction between criminal networks. So, for instance, the deep web has spaces to not just communicate but also make economic transactions, or briefly how to tackle this dark side of the globalization? Thanks.
I mean, you've put your finger exactly on the challenge, and it's the challenge. Every single technological means that has been developed to facilitate our ability to communicate, our ability to interact, our ability to conduct legal transactions. There will always be those who look for ways to take advantage of them for illicit means. And, this is not something that that's new or modern. We had this similar problem back in the 1800s with the development of the telegraph. And there were people who were using the information that was available on the telegraph to get advanced understanding and make trades on the stock market based on information that was not yet available locally. So they were basically cheating the system by using the technology for illicit means. So this has been happening, and I suspect as long as there are technological advances being made, there will be people who will seek to use them for illicit gain. That's the nature of the challenge we have. We talk about all of the enormous benefits that have occurred across a wide selection of our region because of globalization. But there is, as has been pointed out in the panel discussion previously, there is a dark side to globalization. There is an exploitative nature of globalization. And that's where we have to work together, and where there is a positive, beneficial role for governments to play in order to try and protect those who are least well protected. But I don't think you can't take away the technology. We've never been very successful when we try to turn back the clock. That progress will continue being made. But it's a collective sense of responsibility for us to work together. That we have a mutual responsibility to each other for the security of the entire region that will ultimately benefit far more of the population than the corrosive and corruptive effects of criminal behavior. Maybe I'm naive.
Good afternoon, Armil Natalia Herrera from Colombia. Organized crime networks have shown they adapt very quick to the different strategies government develop, which are in most cases consequence of a mix of politics and operational planning. How we can balance these two scenarios, politics and operational planning, to face or being able to close the advantage sometimes they have?
Fantastic question, and I think that's why that is an enormous challenge that we all struggle with, because in many respects, I'm not an expert on the development of the Colombian political system, but in our own country, if you go back and you read the writings of our founding fathers, they intentionally designed our political system to be slow acting, so that we don't make decisions too rapidly, and that poses a challenge because it assumes that both leaders as well as those led will be working essentially for the common good of the entire organization, and perhaps that's not always the case. But that's why we have legal systems in place. That's why it's so important that the legal system be viewed as incorruptible, because it has to be viewed as being a system that is fair and benefits the entire population, and that ultimately, eventually, the legal system will catch up to people who are trying to break the law. But depending on how far back you want to go in history, there have always been criminals who will seek to exploit the advantages that may be available in the legal systems, that will take advantage of the weak, and that will take advantage of of weak governance or of insufficient governance or judicial systems that are not capable of providing for the safety and security of the entire population. And so that's I think the role of good governments to try to root out that corruption where it exists and to try to maintain a system that is viewed at least as fair, not necessarily that provides equally for every member of the population, but at least provides an equal opportunity for every member of the population. That's kind of the basis of our system, and then the countries themselves have to work together, as I've said before, share information on criminal networks that span boundaries and borders between countries that seek to exploit differences in legal systems in one country as opposed to in another country, so that we can try to suppress that. But that's a completely insufficient answer to a problem that is as old as civilization itself, and ultimately underpins why civilization exists, is to try to provide a means for us to collectively take care of ourselves and to be able to look out for each other and improve the quality of life for the population as a whole. So keep studying at the War College and come up with a better answer than the one that I gave you. Yes.
Good afternoon. Marta Verbetic, Woodrow Wilson Center and Gallaudet University. I would like to go back to your discussion of immigration and trafficking, and I'm thinking about Europe right now, which is where I originally come from. And as you know, in Europe there is a big division inside Europe and even within some countries as regards the migrants crisis and how to deal with this. And I think that one of the reasons why Europe has a hard time dealing with this crisis is also our beliefs that we have in liberal democracies of giving everybody a chance, of respecting certain laws for asylum and so on. So I guess my question is I would like a little bit of your input on this challenge, what I see a challenge of balancing security with our beliefs. I think we actually deal with these questions one form or another for quite a while, but I think the refugee crisis, a migrants crisis, presents new challenges and security challenges, and within Europe it's a very difficult, divisive issues, and I think the full consequences we will see only later.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a response that you will find completely and wholly unsatisfactory, but I am standing up here in my capacity not as a policymaker. My capacity is as a member of our security enterprise. And so my responsibility is, once the policy is decided, then to the best of our abilities to put in place the mechanisms to be able to carry out that policy. That means to build the relationships of trust and confidence, not just within the members of the U.S. Armed Forces, but between the U.S. Armed Forces and partner nation armed forces with whom we work very closely, but also with the U.S. Armed Forces and members of our law enforcement, our diplomatic corps, our intelligence corps, so that we can best, efficiently, effectively implement whatever policies our political leaders put in place. They decide, we implement. So it's not the answer that you're looking for, but that is my role, but is to make sure I do everything that I possibly can do to establish those relationships of trust to be able to reach out across a network of our own that can be more effective and has greater reach and has the opportunity to be able to successfully defeat the efforts of these adversary networks. Thank you. Sir.
Juan Belikov, Banco Mundial. I will do the question in Spanish.
Hold on a second. All right, trusty translating team, back to work.
Gracias por su presentación. Han sido muy interesantes todas las presentaciones del día de hoy. Una de las preguntas que quisiera formularle, usted destacó, y creo que es muy importante subrayar el hecho, que el problema del narcotráfico no es el principal problema de la región, es solo uno de los pequeños problemas del problema de seguridad ciudadana que tenemos en la región. Tomemos un caso extremo, Colombia, los colombianos aquí presentes pueden convalidar el dato, grupos como FARC han recibido mucho más recursos de la extorsión que del narcotráfico. Consecuentemente, la pregunta es la siguiente: cuando hablamos de la reestructuración de los aparatos gubernamentales para enfrentar este problema y de construir redes que puedan enfrentar el problema, ¿cómo ponemos a bordo de estas redes otras instituciones que no son estrictamente de control y represión del delito, sino también las de prevención y sobre todo las que reducen la impunidad? En la región latinoamericana en particular, uno de los mayores déficits está en la investigación criminal. Menos del 3% de los homicidios terminan con un condenado. Estos son datos de nuestra región. ¿Cómo hacemos para resolver ese tema? Eso es de la perspectiva de cómo enfocar el problema de arriba, enfocado desde abajo. El 80% de nuestros jóvenes, entre el 40 y el 70%, varía de país en país, están sin empleo formal y no tienen expectativa de conseguir un empleo formal, con lo cual sus alternativas son la migración, el crimen organizado y, el que es un poco más soñador, la violencia organizada en cualquiera de sus expresiones. ¿Cómo ponemos a bordo de estas redes que tenemos, que no se limitan al control, sino que también a los otros aspectos de prevención y de judicialización de los problemas, de manera de poder resolver este problema? Yo entiendo que las agencias norteamericanas tienen restricciones, las agencias federales, porque tienen mandatos específicos, y agencias, por ejemplo, que el FBI, que podría compartir conocimiento en materia de investigación criminal, o el Attorney General, que tiene competencias exclusivamente en lo que afecta a ciudadanos norteamericanos, no tienen competencias en el exterior. Pero eso es una falencia que creo tenemos que resolver para construir esta red positiva de cara a poder darle a los países mejores capacidades. Solo para darle dos ejemplos. Los 4 municipios del país centroamericano que más está afectado por narcotráfico, no quiero estigmatizar, por eso no voy a dar el nombre, pero es fácil deducirlo. En los 4 municipios por el que pasa entre el 25 y el 40% de la droga que viene a Estados Unidos, en total hay 64 policías en toda esa región. Otro caso, la ciudad de Rosario, la Medellín moderna de la Argentina, la equivalente a la que fue Medellín en los años 80, en narcotráfico. Hoy la ciudad de Rosario en la Argentina cumple exactamente ese mismo rol, con esa misma dimensión. No tiene un solo perito contable para hacer investigaciones de delitos económicos vinculados al narcotráfico, por falta de capacidad institucional. Entonces la pregunta es, ¿cómo podemos, más allá del control y de la represión, apuntalar esto otro que previene el problema de fondo, en vez de estar apagando el fuego y resolviendo los síntomas nada más? Gracias.
First, let me start by saluting the incredible hard work, professionalism, bravery of the Armed Forces and National Police of Colombia for the terrific work that they have done over decades now to bring Colombia to the point of standing at the literally at the door of a historic peace. I fully expect that the Colombian people will arrive at the right solution for them that will result in a peace. The types of activities that you have pointed out, that in addition to drug trafficking that FARC has been engaged in previously, that ELN has been engaged in, that other criminal elements and illegally armed groups are currently engaged in, are now or will be criminal activities that must be treated and as the significant challenges to internal security that they are. You talk about the problem of impunity, and that addresses the point that arriving at a final satisfactory resolution will require more than just the work of the armed forces, more than just the work of the national police. It will require the same courageous work that the judicial system has engaged in order to suppress the criminal cartels, the drug cartels that you mentioned earlier. And it will require enormous capability and professionalism on the part of the penal system that is responsible for incarceration, so that there is a high likelihood that if you commit a crime, if you are charged with a crime, you will receive a trial. If you are found guilty, you will be imprisoned, and that you will pay a penalty. And that penalty is enough to serve as a dissuasion. But that talks to the issue of, regardless of the country, and I'm not. This is not Colombia. This is not Central America. This is here in my own country as well. All of the pieces have to work together, and the people have to have faith and trust that all of the system works together and is fair and equitable, and that if you commit a crime and you're found guilty, that you will go to jail. And that has to, I think, be something that is that everyone can rely on, so they have faith that the government is taking care of them. That is a process that has already been described. It's not building that faith and that trust takes time, and it's not a matter of a single electoral cycle or a single session of the legislature. It's something that will take place over the course of a generation, and that certainly has been the experience that we've had, and we still have challenges to this day. So I think that it'll be a problem that we'll all work on together. The hook.
Admiral Tidd, any more questions? He'll never accept an invitation from us. So let's give him a break. Please join me in thanking him.
Thanks very much.
See you real quick after this, right? So when we began, Ms. Hollis mentioned our previous book, Convergence, published 3 years ago, which we did produce quite a few copies of. It generated a lot of conversation and, frankly, a lot of criticism. And for that reason, we actually thanked and acknowledged those people who criticized that book in our acknowledgments to Beyond Convergence, because it was their criticisms and the questions that people raised that led us to agree that we needed to do a follow-up book. So I encourage you, please read this book, Beyond Convergence, and criticize it, challenge it, share it with people, tweet it if that's what you do. But the point is to generate continuing question about how we're dealing with these, what Chris Fussell called wicked problems. Are we being innovative enough in our own structures and our own processes in meeting these challenges? Do we understand the problems clearly enough? Are we developing the right kinds of capabilities? Obviously, we can't answer all those questions here, so I'm going to suggest the wisdom of the great American strategist Homer Simpson, who said, "Alcohol is both the cause and the solution to all our problems," and I invite you to join us in the North Atrium for a wine reception. Thank you all very much.